Power doesn't break men. Betrayal does. When King Draven Kaelthorn watched his empire strip everything from the woman who carried his future, he learned the oldest truth kingdoms never speak aloud. The throne protects no one but itself. This is the story of an alpha king who conquered nations but couldn't save the one soul that mattered. Stay until the end, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about loyalty, sacrifice, and survival. Drop a like and comment your city below so I know my tribe is watching. The Moon Court celebration had been orchestrated to perfection. 300 nobles filled the palace hall beneath crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across black marble floors. Musicians played ancient ceremonial hymns on instruments carved from ivory and bone. Servants moved between tables carrying platters of roasted venison, honeyed wine, and delicacies imported from the far edges of the empire. Everyone pretended to celebrate the future heir growing inside Queen Selene Valaris, but Draven Kaelthorn could smell the fear underneath the silk and perfume. He stood near the obsidian throne, watching everything with the cold assessment of a predator who'd spent 33 years learning to read power dynamics in a single glance. Warriors shifted their weight when his eyes passed over them. Nobles smiled too wide when addressing him. Even his own brother Cassian kept 3 feet of distance at all times, speaking only when spoken to first. Good. Fear kept empires intact better than love ever could. Across the hall, Selene moved through the crowd with practiced grace. Her silver gown caught the candlelight as she smiled at some lord's joke, touched a duchess's arm in reassurance, and somehow made the performance look effortless. 6 months pregnant and still carrying herself like a warrior queen who could gut a traitor with nothing but eye contact. She was the most dangerous woman Draven had ever met. That's why he'd married her. Their mate bond hummed beneath his ribs, that ancient connection every alpha bloodline swore defined their existence. Priests called it sacred. Draven called it biological fact. When an alpha found their true mate, the bond formed whether either party wanted it or not. Selene's wolf spirit had recognized his the moment they'd first locked eyes 3 years ago during a border negotiation. The attraction had been violent, the marriage had been political, but the bond became something neither of them expected. Real. Draven drained his goblet of wine and watched Cassian laugh too loudly at something the war general said. His younger brother had always been charming where Draven was brutal, quick with compliments while Draven calculated threats. The nobles loved Cassian because he made power look friendly. Draven knew better. Friendly men didn't survive in Valor. Ruthless ones built empires. The music shifted into something slower, more ceremonial. Selene caught his eye across the hall and gave him that small half-smile that meant she was exhausted, but refused to show weakness in front of the court. He started toward her, ready to extract them both from this performance. Then her face went white. Not pale. White. Like blood had stopped reaching her skin entirely. Draven moved before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He crossed 30 feet of crowded hall in seconds, shouldering nobles aside without apology. By the time he reached her, Selene had one hand braced against a marble column and the other pressed against her swollen belly. "What's wrong?" His voice came out low enough only she could hear it. Nothing. Her smile stayed locked in place even as her knuckles went bloodless against the stone. Just tired, liar. The mate bond wasn't humming anymore. It was screaming. Something twisted and wrong pulsed through the connection between them like poison spreading through water. "We're leaving." Draven caught her elbow. "Now. I'm fine." Her violet eyes flashed with that stubborn fire that usually made him want to either kiss her or argue until dawn. "I can finish." She collapsed before finishing the sentence. One moment Selene was standing. The next she crumpled like someone had cut her strings. Draven caught her before she hit the floor, his arms wrapping around her body as 300 nobles went silent at once. The music stopped. Golden goblets crashed against stone as guests jerked backward. And for the first time in 15 years of ruling Valor through war, conquest, and political massacre, Draven Kaelthorn felt terror cut through him like a blade between ribs. "Get the healers!" His voice echoed across the frozen hall. "Now!" Guards scattered. Nobles whispered. Cassian appeared at his shoulder with concern that looked genuine, but probably wasn't. "Brother, let me help." "Move!" Draven's growl carried enough alpha command to make even trained warriors flinch. Cassian backed away with raised palms, smart enough to recognize real danger when it surfaced. Draven carried Selene from the hall without looking back. Her head lolled against his chest. Her breathing came too shallow. And that wrongness in the mate bond kept spreading like rot through wood. By the time he reached their private chambers, 6 royal healers were already waiting. They'd set up tables covered in medical instruments, vials of medicine, and bowls of water that steamed with herbs Draven didn't recognize. "Lay her here." The head healer gestured toward the bed. "Fix her." Draven placed Selene down with more care than he'd shown anything in his life, whatever it costs. The healers worked in practiced silence. They checked her pulse, examined her eyes, pressed fingers against her abdomen while murmuring observations to each other in medical terminology too technical for Draven to follow. He stood at the foot of the bed, useless. Kings commanded armies. Kings executed traitors. Kings reshaped borders with signed documents and military force. But standing in that room watching Selene's chest rise and fall too slowly, Draven discovered the limits of absolute power. All that strength meant nothing here. After 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, the head healer finally turned to face him. The woman was 60 years old, with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen enough royal crises to remain calm through catastrophe. "Your Majesty." She chose her words carefully. "The Queen is stable for now. For now." Draven caught the qualifier immediately. "What's wrong with her? We're not certain yet." The healer glanced at her colleagues, some silent communication passing between them. "Her vitals are unusual. The pregnancy appears healthy, but something is affecting Her Majesty's wolf spirit." "Affecting how?" "It's weakening." The room went cold, or maybe that was just Draven's blood turning to ice in his veins. Weakening meant dying. A wolf spirit was the core of every shifter's existence. Lose it, and you lost yourself piece by piece until nothing remained but an empty shell that used to be human. "How long?" His voice came out flat. "We don't know." The healer met his eyes without flinching. "We've never seen this pattern before. It could be exhaustion from the pregnancy. It could be an illness we haven't identified yet. We need time to research. Figure it out." Draven turned away from her before his expression revealed too much. "Whatever resources you need, take them. But I want answers by morning." The healers bowed and retreated, leaving Draven alone with Selene's unconscious form and the mate bond screaming wrongness through every nerve. He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down heavily. Selene looked smaller like this, without that fierce energy that usually made her seem larger than her actual size. Her golden hair spread across the pillow like spilled light. Her face remained too pale. For 3 hours, Draven sat there watching her breathe. He'd killed men with his bare hands. He'd conquered territories through military campaigns that left thousands dead. He'd executed political rivals in public squares to send messages about the cost of treachery. None of that prepared him for this. Around midnight, Selene's eyes finally opened. She stared at the ceiling for several seconds before turning her head toward him. "How long was I out?" Her voice came out hoarse. "Long enough." Draven kept his tone neutral, even though relief threatened to crack through his chest. "How do you feel?" "Like something inside me is dying." She said it matter of fact, no drama or exaggeration, then added, "I need to tell you something." The way she said it made Draven's instincts start screaming again. "Tell me what?" Selene pushed herself up slowly until she sat with her back against the headboard. She looked at her hands for a long moment, those elegant fingers that had once commanded as much respect as his fists. Then she told him the truth. "My bloodline carries a curse." Her words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. "Every woman born to my family awakens it at 25. It slowly destroys our wolf spirit and erases our humanity piece by piece. My mother disappeared before I was born. Her mother before that. Every generation has watched their daughters transform into something neither human nor wolf, just nothing." Draven processed this information with the same cold analysis he applied to military intelligence reports. Selene had turned 25 6 months ago, right before they discovered she was pregnant. "How long do you have?" He kept emotion out of the question. 4 months. Maybe less. Selene met his eyes with that unflinching honesty he'd always admired even when it gutted him. "My wolf is already fading. Soon my voice will go. Then memory. Then everything that makes me human. I'll become something else, Draven, something you won't recognize. No. The word came out harder than intended. We'll find a way to break it. You think my family hasn't tried? Selene's laugh carried no humor. They've spent centuries looking for solutions. There aren't any. Then we'll make one. Draven leaned forward. I don't accept that. You don't get to choose. Selene's voice cracked finally. This isn't a war you can win with strategy or force. It's written into my blood. Into our child's blood. The last part hit him like a physical blow. The baby. Will carry the same curse. Selene pressed both hands against her swollen belly. If it's a girl, she'll face this at 13. If it's a boy, he'll pass it to his daughters. Either way, our bloodline is poisoned. Silence filled the chamber. Outside the windows, Valor spread beneath them in layers of torchlight and shadow. An empire built through generations of conquest. Draven's ancestors had forged this kingdom from tribal territories and minor holdings through superior strength and absolute ruthlessness. They'd conquered everything except this. I need to think. Draven stood abruptly. The healers will keep monitoring you. Don't leave this room. Where would I go? Selene's smile looked broken. I'm dying slowly in the most secure place in the Empire. There's nowhere left to run. Draven left before she could see his composure crack. He made it as far as the throne room before putting his fist through a marble column. The stone cracked with a sound like thunder. Pain exploded through his knuckles. Blood ran down his fingers. It changed nothing. Behind him, footsteps approached carefully. Cassian's voice drifted through the darkness. Brother, I heard what happened. Is Selene? Get out. Draven didn't turn around. I'm only trying to help. Get out! The alpha command in those words made Cassian retreat immediately. Smart man. Draven was 5 seconds from killing someone just to feel something other than helplessness, and his brother had always been good at reading survival odds. Alone again, Draven stood in the empty throne room where he'd pronounced judgment on traitors and declared wars and reshaped the political landscape of 3 kingdoms. All that power, all that control, and he couldn't save his own mate from blood magic written into her bones. The cruelest part wasn't watching her die. It was knowing their child would inherit the same fate, that he'd helped create a life destined for the same slow erasure that was already consuming Selene. For the first time since taking the crown at 18, Draven Kaelthorn understood the real cost of power. It meant bearing witness to tragedies you couldn't prevent while maintaining the appearance of absolute control. It meant swallowing rage and grief and terror because showing weakness would crack the Empire's foundation. It meant standing alone in throne rooms at midnight with bloody knuckles and no answers while the woman you'd built your life around slowly disappeared. The mate bond pulsed weakly in his chest. Still there, but fading, just like her. The next 3 weeks passed like watching someone drown in slow motion. Selene continued attending court functions because she refused to show vulnerability in front of nobles who measured every weakness for future exploitation. She smiled at visiting dignitaries. She reviewed trade agreements. She maintained the illusion of strength even as her wolf spirit faded day by day. Draven felt it through the mate bond. That connection between them grew thinner, more fragile, like a rope fraying one strand at a time. The healers had no solutions. They tried medicines that did nothing. They consulted ancient texts that offered sympathy but no cures. They whispered about balance and natural order and other philosophical nonsense that didn't fix anything. Meanwhile, Cassian circled closer. Draven's younger brother had always been ambitious in that careful way that looked like loyalty until you examined it too closely. He visited Selene often, bringing flowers and kind words. He offered to manage royal duties while she recovered. He positioned himself as the concerned family member everyone could rely on during crisis. Political theater. Draven recognized the performance because he'd seen it before. Ambitious men didn't seize power through obvious coups. They waited for vulnerabilities, then slid into authority gaps while pretending to help. The Empire was watching their King Alpha face a problem he couldn't solve through force, watching his mate weaken despite his strength, watching absolute power meet absolute helplessness. Some of them started wondering if Draven was the right ruler for the throne. He knew because intelligence reports kept landing on his desk, whispered conversations between nobles, questions about succession. speculation about what happened if the queen died before producing an heir. Cassian's name came up frequently in those reports. 2 weeks after the Mooncourt incident, Draven met with his war council. 12 military commanders and strategic advisors sat around a table covered in maps showing empire borders, trade routes, and potential threats. The northern territories are restless. General Markoth gestured toward the mountain regions. They're testing our border patrols. Nothing major yet, but the pattern suggests coordination. Send 2 additional battalions. Draven barely glanced at the map. Fortify the mountain passes. If they push harder, burn 3 villages as warning. Your Majesty. One of the younger advisors hesitated. That might escalate. It'll end the problem faster than negotiation. Draven's tone left no room for debate. Next, they moved through reports on trade disputes, diplomatic tensions, and resource allocation. Standard Empire maintenance that used to engage his full attention but now felt like background noise while the real crisis consumed him privately. Halfway through discussing grain shipments, Draven felt it. The mate bond lurched sideways like something vital had just torn loose. He was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with instinct. The council members froze, reading the shift in his posture with the survival instincts of people who'd learned to recognize when their alpha king turned dangerous. Meeting's over. Draven was already moving toward the door. Leave. They scattered. Draven ran through palace corridors that suddenly felt too long. Guards pressed themselves against walls to avoid his path. Servants dropped trays and didn't stop to clean up the mess. By the time he reached the royal chambers, Selene was sitting on the floor beside their bed, with tears running down her face. Silent tears. She was crying without making any sound. Draven dropped to his knees beside her. What happened? Selene opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, lips forming words that produced no sound whatsoever. Her voice was gone. The curse had taken it. Draven pulled her against his chest while she shook silently. All that strength he'd built through years of conquest and political domination meant nothing here. He couldn't fight blood magic. He couldn't execute curses. He couldn't threaten fate into submission. He could only hold her while pieces of who she was disappeared. That night they didn't speak. Selene couldn't. Draven didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like empty promises. Instead, they lay together in the darkness while the mate bond grew thinner and the empire outside their windows continued spinning with all its political machinery and power structures that suddenly seemed meaningless. Around dawn, Selene pressed a piece of paper into his hand. She'd written 4 words in shaky handwriting. I'm leaving soon. Draven read them twice. What do you mean? She wrote quickly. Can't let them see me transform. Won't let our child grow up watching mother become monster. Better they think I'm dead. No. Draven crumpled the paper. You're not leaving. Selene grabbed another sheet and wrote faster. You can't stop this. No one can. When I start losing my mind, I become dangerous. The curse turns us into something savage. I won't risk you, won't risk our baby. We'll lock you somewhere safe. She underlined her next words hard enough to tear the paper. No cage. If I'm dying, I die free. Draven stared at her for a long moment. He'd negotiated peace treaties with enemy kingdoms. He'd outmaneuvered assassination attempts from within his own court. He'd survived succession challenges and military coups through superior strategy and ruthless execution. But he couldn't argue with someone who'd already accepted death as inevitable. When? He forced the question out. When are you planning to leave? Selene wrote. Soon. When I start losing memory. Before I forget who you are. The words cut deeper than any blade. I won't let you face this alone. Draven caught her hand. Whatever happens. Selene pressed her fingers against his mouth, stopping the promise before he could finish it. Then she wrote one final sentence. Some battles have to be fought alone. But Gates. 3 days later, this empire organized the Imperial Winter Hunt. It was tradition. Every year, the royal family led nobles and warriors into the northern wilderness to hunt winter game and demonstrate their connection to the savage power that supposedly made them superior to common people. Political theater wrapped in ceremony, wrapped in controlled violence. Draven tried to cancel it. Selene refused. She wrote him a note saying the empire needed to see their queen still strong, needed to believe everything remained stable. She was staging her own disappearance and using royal tradition to do it. Draven saw it coming but had no moves to counter her strategy. The hunt departed on a gray morning when snow fell like ash across Vylor. 50 riders dressed in furs and leather followed the royal party into forests that stretched for hundreds of miles. Selene rode beside Draven on a white horse, her face expressionless behind layers of winter clothing. She looked like a warrior queen heading into battle. Maybe she was. They rode for hours through territories where wolves watched from shadows, and winter stripped everything down to bones. The hunting party spread out tracking deer trails, while Draven stayed close to Selene. She kept pushing ahead, farther from the group. When they were finally alone among snow-covered trees and frozen streams, Selene dismounted. She pulled out paper and wrote quickly. "This is far enough. Go back to the others." Draven read the note, then looked at her. "I know what you're planning," Selene wrote. "Then you know you can't stop me." "I could." Draven stepped closer. "I could tie you to that horse and drag you back to the palace, lock you in chambers with guards who won't let you leave," she wrote. "You'd hate yourself, I'd hate you, and I'd still die trapped instead of free." The mate bond pulsed between them, weak now but still there, still connecting them across that space that felt like miles, even though they stood 5 feet apart. "Come with me." Selene's next note looked desperate. "Leave the Empire. Let Cassian have it. We'll find somewhere remote where Where you can what?" Draven's voice came out harsh. "Where you can transform into something that doesn't remember my name? Where our child inherits the same fate with no resources to fight it? Better than dying inside that palace surrounded by people waiting for you to fall apart." She wasn't wrong. Draven had felt it. The way nobles watched him now. The way Cassian's concern looked more like calculation every day. The way power shifted when strength showed cracks. But leaving meant abandoning everything his bloodline had built. Everything his ancestors had conquered and consolidated and passed down through generations of Alpha Kings who'd never retreated from anything. "I can't." The admission tasted like poison. The Empire needs... Selene grabbed his coat with both hands and pulled him down until their foreheads touched. When she pulled back, her violet eyes burned with all the fierce energy that had made him fall for her in the first place. She mouthed 3 words without sound. "I love you." Then she shoved him backward hard enough to make him stumble. By the time Draven caught his balance, Selene was running. She sprinted through the snow with inhuman speed, her wolf spirit flaring one last time as she disappeared into the wilderness. Within seconds, the forest swallowed her completely. Draven stood there while snow fell and the mate bond stretched thinner. He should chase her, should use his alpha strength to track her down and drag her back regardless of consequences. Instead, he watched the forest where she'd vanished and made a choice. He let her go. Not because he didn't love her, because he did. And maybe she was right. Maybe dying free was better than dying trapped inside palace walls while an empire watched your transformation. But he'd make them believe she was already dead. Because a missing queen became a search. A dead queen became grief. And grief gave him the rage he'd need for what came next. Draven ripped his own coat, tore fabric and scattered it across the snow. He found Selene's royal ring where she'd left it deliberately and placed it beside massive bear tracks that ran parallel to where she'd fled. Then he started screaming for the hunting party. When they arrived, Draven was on his knees in the snow, surrounded by staged evidence. The torn clothes, the tracks, the ring. He didn't have to fake the anguish in his voice when he told them his mate was gone. The Empire believed its queen had been devoured by a wild beast. And that night, Draven hunted down the actual bear whose tracks he'd used for the deception. He killed it with his bare hands in a rage so violent, his warriors later swore they'd seen the King Alpha lose his humanity entirely. They were right. Grief poisoned him more effectively than any assassin ever could. But while the Empire mourned and whispered and measured what this tragedy meant for political stability, while Cassian offered condolences that sounded genuine but weren't, while priests performed funeral ceremonies for a queen they'd never recovered. Miles away in the frozen mountains, Selene ran towards something darker than death. She ran toward the wild wolves who accepted what she was becoming, and behind her, the last threads of the mate bond finally snapped. Draven felt it the moment the connection severed completely, like someone had reached inside his chest and ripped out something vital. He was standing on the palace balcony overlooking the Empire when it happened. No one around to witness the moment an Alpha King became half alive. The city below continued functioning. Torches burned, guards patrolled. Life went on with all its ordinary momentum. But Draven Kaelthorn had just lost the only thing that made ruling this empire feel like anything other than hollow theater. And the worst part wasn't the grief. It was knowing that somewhere in those mountains, Selene was facing the curse alone, while he stood here playing king for nobles who would replace him the moment he showed too much weakness. 3 years. That's how long the mate bond stayed severed. 3 years of Draven ruling Vaelor with mechanical efficiency while something vital inside him remained missing. 3 years of Cassian watching and waiting. 3 years of an empire obeying its king while sensing something fundamental had broken. 3 years of Selene surviving among wild wolves in territories beyond civilization. Neither of them knew the curse had miscalculated. Neither knew her pregnancy had interrupted the transformation. Neither knew she was trapped between human and beast, unable to complete either change. And neither knew that fate had one more catastrophe waiting for them, because 3 years later, an ancient seer would arrive at the palace carrying impossible news. The dead queen was still alive. 3 years changed everything and nothing. Vaelor still functioned with brutal efficiency. Trade routes operated on schedule. Border patrols maintained territorial control. The Empire's machinery churned forward because that's what empires did regardless of who stood at the center bleeding internally. But the man ruling from the Obsidian throne was no longer fully alive. Draven Kaelthorn moved through his days with mechanical precision. He attended council meetings where advisors discussed grain shortages and military deployments. He reviewed diplomatic correspondence from neighboring kingdoms, testing his borders for weakness. He executed judgments in the throne room with the same cold efficiency that had always defined his reign. The nobles stopped whispering about his grief after the first year. They started whispering about his brutality instead. Because something had shifted in Draven after Selene disappeared. The calculated violence that once served strategic purposes became something darker. Messier. When border raiders attacked a northern village, Draven didn't just send troops to eliminate the threat. He rode north himself and spent 3 days hunting every member of the raiding party through frozen forests until he'd personally killed all 47 men. He returned to the capital covered in blood that wasn't his own. The message landed clearly. The King Alpha had lost his capacity for mercy along with his mate. General Markoth tried addressing it once during a private war council meeting. "Your Majesty, the men are starting to fear you more than the enemy." Good. Draven didn't look up from the military reports spread across his desk. Fear keeps them sharp. There's a difference between respect and terror. Is there? Draven finally met the general's eyes. Because from where I'm sitting, both keep soldiers alive and borders secure. Results matter. Everything else is philosophy. Markoth didn't push further. Smart man. The few advisors who'd questioned Draven's increasingly violent approach to governance had found themselves reassigned to remote outposts where their opinions mattered less. The truth was simpler than political theory. Draven had discovered that rage felt better than grief. Action felt better than helplessness. And if he stayed busy enough executing threats to the Empire, he didn't have time to think about violet eyes or silent tears or mate bonds that had severed like cut rope. Except at night. Every night, Draven stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city and felt the ghost of that connection pulsing in his chest. Not real anymore, just phantom pain where something vital used to exist. He'd torn apart the northern wilderness looking for Selene's body in those first months. Found nothing. No bones, no evidence. Just endless snow and wolves that watched from tree lines without attacking. Eventually, he'd accepted what the stage scene suggested. She was gone. Devoured, erased from existence except for the memories that wouldn't stop playing on repeat every time he closed his eyes. The Empire moved forward because that's what empires did, but the king ruling it remained stuck in the moment he'd watched her run into those trees and made the choice to let her go. That choice haunted him worse than any battlefield decision ever had. Because kings could justify military casualties as strategic necessity. They could rationalize political executions as stability maintenance. But watching your mate choose death over captivity and doing nothing to stop her was a different category of failure entirely. It meant accepting that some battles couldn't be won through superior force. and Draven Kaelthorn had built his entire existence around the belief that overwhelming strength solved every problem. Turns out that was a lie power told itself to feel invincible. 3 years into ruling an empire while half dead inside, Draven had learned one truth his ancestors never carved into royal monuments. The throne didn't belong to the strongest ruler. It belonged to whoever could endure the most suffering while maintaining the appearance of absolute control. And he was very good at pretending. Cassian made his moves slowly. Draven's younger brother had always been patient in the way ambitious men learn to be when immediate action meant execution. For 3 years, Cassian positioned himself as the reliable prince who managed diplomatic relations while his grief-stricken brother handled military matters with excessive violence. The nobles loved him for it. Cassian attended social functions Draven avoided. He smoothed over political tensions the king created through blunt force approaches. He smiled at visiting dignitaries and made power look approachable instead of terrifying. He built a network of loyalists who started asking quiet questions about succession. Draven noticed because he'd been raised in royal courts where survival meant reading political currents before they became deadly. He saw how Cassian's supporters positioned themselves in key administrative roles, watched how certain military commanders started deferring to his brother's opinions during strategy sessions, tracked the flow of gold from noble houses into Cassian's personal accounts. Classic coup preparation. The old Draven would have executed his brother immediately and displayed the body as warning. The new Draven felt too hollowed out to care about palace intrigue when his mate was dead, and the Empire's political theater suddenly seemed meaningless. Let Cassian have it. The throne wasn't worth what it cost anyway. But then the seer arrived. She came during a winter storm that dropped 3 feet of snow on the capital in a single night. The palace guards almost didn't let her through the gates because she looked like every other doomsday prophet who wandered in from the wilderness claiming visions. Except she carried a silver medallion that had belonged to Selene. Draven was in the throne room reviewing execution orders when guards dragged the old woman before him. She was maybe 70 with white hair and eyes that had gone cloudy with age. Her clothes were travel-worn and her hands shook from cold, or fear, or both. "Your Majesty." The head guard gestured toward the seer. "This woman claims she has information about the late queen. Then she can join the other lunatics who've made similar claims." Draven signed another execution order without looking up. "Remove her." "Wait!" The seer's voice cut through the room with unexpected force. She held up the medallion, letting candlelight catch the engraved surface. "I found this in the Forbidden Mountains, beside a stream where wolves gather under the full moon." Draven's hand stopped moving. That medallion had been Selene's, a family heirloom passed down through her bloodline for generations. She'd worn it every day until her disappearance. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out too quiet. "I told you." The seer stepped forward despite the guards reaching for weapons. The mountains where the wild packs hunt, where a woman runs with them who carries violet eyes and golden hair. The throne room went silent. Every noble and guard present knew those details. Selene's appearance had been distinctive enough that descriptions appeared in royal portraits throughout the palace. But claiming she was alive pushed past rational belief into obvious fraud. "The queen is dead." Draven stood slowly. "Devoured 3 years ago." "Is she?" The seer's cloudy eyes fixed on him with unsettling precision. "Then why do the wolves speak of a ghost woman who protects their young and hunts beside the pack? Why do mountain villagers whisper about a savage thing that's neither human nor beast, watching them from cliff edges? Because grief makes people see things that aren't there." Draven descended the throne steps. "You're selling me hope wrapped in convenient lies." "I'm selling you nothing." The seer held out the medallion. "I'm telling you what I witnessed with my own eyes. Your mate lives, changed, broken, but alive." Draven stopped 3 feet from her. Every logical part of his mind screamed that this was manipulation. Some elaborate scheme Cassian had orchestrated to destabilize him further, or a con artist who'd found Selene's medallion and spun a story around it. But the mate bond that had been silent for 3 years suddenly trembled in his chest. Not the full connection, just an echo. A whisper of something that used to be there stirring back to life. It could have been imagination, could have been desperate hope manifesting as physical sensation. Could have been his mind playing tricks because he wanted to believe so badly that logic became optional. Draven didn't care. If there's even a chance. He took the medallion from her shaking hands. Tell me where. The seer gave him coordinates. Mountain ranges north of the Empire's established borders. Territory so remote that maps labeled it wilderness and assumed nothing human survived there. Draven turned to his guards. Prepare my horse and supplies for 2 weeks. We leave within the hour. Your Majesty. General Markoth stepped forward. This could be a trap. Let me send scouts first to verify. No. Draven's tone ended the discussion. I'm going. Anyone who wants to follow can try keeping up. Behind him, Cassian appeared in the throne room entrance, looking concerned in that practiced way he'd perfected over 3 years. Brother, this is clearly a deception. You can't just abandon the Empire chasing rumors. Watch me. Draven walked past his brother without slowing down. He had 2 hours of daylight left and 3 years of grief driving him north toward either salvation or complete destruction. Either outcome felt better than standing in that palace one more day, pretending to care about governance, while the ghost of his mate haunted every corridor. The council tried stopping him. The war advisors argued about security. The nobles whispered about instability and poor judgment, and how grief had finally broken their king's famous strategic mind. Draven ignored all of it. By sunset, he rode north with 20 warriors who'd been loyal enough or stupid enough to follow. They traveled through snowstorms and frozen forests where normal men would have turned back. 3 days into the journey, half the warriors retreated. Too cold, too dangerous, too far from civilization. Draven kept going. On the 5th day, they reached the coordinates the seer had provided, a mountain valley where wolf tracks covered every surface and the trees grew so dense that sunlight barely penetrated. The remaining warriors set up camp while Draven scouted ahead. He moved through the wilderness with the enhanced senses every alpha bloodline claimed as genetic advantage, tracking scents, reading signs in disturbed snow, following patterns only predators recognized. He found the wolves first. A pack of 30 gathered near a frozen stream. They should have scattered when a human approached their territory. Instead, they watched him with unsettling intelligence, like they were waiting for something. Then he saw her. She emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the stream, barefoot despite the snow, wearing animal skins that looked hand-stitched, golden hair hanging past her shoulders in tangled waves, violet eyes that still burned with the same fierce energy he'd memorized 3 years ago. Selene stood there, surrounded by wolves like some forgotten goddess of winter, wild, changed, but unmistakably alive. The mate bond exploded back to life between them with force that dropped Draven to his knees. It wasn't the smooth connection it had been before. This felt jagged, broken in places, like something that had been shattered and poorly reassembled. But it was there. She was there. Draven tried speaking and found his voice had stopped working. 3 years of commanding armies and pronouncing judgments, and now he couldn't force out a single word. Selene tilted her head, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. For a terrible moment, he thought she didn't recognize him, that the curse had already stolen her memory, and he was staring at a stranger wearing his mate's face. Then her lips moved. No sound came out, but he could read the shape of his name forming silently. She remembered. Draven stood on shaking legs. He'd faced enemy armies without fear, had executed political rivals without hesitation, had ruled an empire with absolute confidence. But crossing that frozen stream toward a woman who'd chosen death over captivity required more courage than every battlefield decision he'd ever made. The wolves didn't attack. They watched as Draven waded through icy water and climbed the opposite bank. Watched as he stopped 5 feet from Selene with 3 years of grief and rage and relief crashing through him. She looked different, thinner, harder. The softness that palace life had cultivated had been stripped away by survival in conditions that would have killed normal people. But she was alive. Draven reached for her and Selene bolted. She ran like prey escaping a predator, one moment standing there, the next vanishing into the forest with inhuman speed. The wolves followed her, and Draven understood what the seer had meant. Selene wasn't human anymore. Wasn't fully beast either. She'd become something caught between states. Surviving, but not living. Breathing, but not whole. He chased her anyway. His warriors called after him, but Draven ignored them. He crashed through frozen underbrush, tracking her scent through territories where normal humans would have gotten lost in minutes. The pursuit lasted hours. Every time he got close, Selene would disappear around another ridge or down another valley. The wolves ran interference, not attacking, but making his path deliberately difficult. Finally, as moonlight replaced sunset, Draven cornered her against a cliff face where retreat meant a 100-foot drop. Selene pressed her back against stone, chest heaving from exertion. Her violet eyes reflected moonlight like an animal's. She opened her mouth and nothing came out except ragged breathing. "I'm not here to drag you back." Draven stopped 20 feet away, hands visible and empty. "I just need to understand what happened." Selene stared at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a stick and started scratching words into the snow. Curse. Interrupted. Stuck. 3 words that explained everything and nothing. You're trapped between forms. Draven read the message twice. The pregnancy stopped the transformation halfway. Selene nodded, then wrote more. Baby stopped growing. Still alive, still inside. Can't change, can't go back. Horror washed through Draven as he processed the implications. Their child was suspended in development, alive but frozen at whatever stage it had reached when the curse interrupted. And Selene's body couldn't complete either transformation because the pregnancy made both impossible. She'd been living like this for 3 years. Trapped, unable to move forward or backward, losing pieces of humanity while unable to fully become beast. How long before you lose everything? He forced the question out. Selene's hands shook as she wrote. Memory slipping. Forget words. Forget names. Soon forget you. The mate bond pulsed between them, carrying 3 years of separation and suffering. Draven felt everything she'd endured in those mountains, the isolation, the slow erasure of identity, the daily choice to keep surviving even as the person she'd been disappeared piece by piece, and she'd faced it alone because he'd let her go. That choice haunted him worse than grief ever had, because at least grief was clean, irreversible. But this was watching the consequence of his decision play out in real time. I should have chased you. The admission came out raw. Should have dragged you back regardless of what you wanted. Should have locked you somewhere safe and forced you to let me help. Selene shook her head violently, then wrote in large letters, No cage, better wild than trapped. Better for who? Draven's voice cracked. You're dying slowly in these mountains, while I spent 3 years thinking you were already dead. How is any of this better? Selene dropped the stick. She moved toward him with that inhuman grace that came from living among wolves. When she stopped inches away, Draven could see the curse's damage up close. Her eyes still held intelligence, but it flickered, like candlelight fighting wind, sometimes focused, sometimes distant. Her hands trembled constantly. Her breathing remained too shallow. She was fading in front of him. Selene reached up and pressed her palm against his chest directly over where the mate bond pulsed. Her touch sent electricity through him, not the smooth connection from before. This felt desperate, broken, like 2 shattered pieces trying to fit back together. Then she pulled back and wrote one more message. Go home. Forget me. Live. No. The word came out harder than intended. I didn't spend 3 years half dead to find you and walk away again. Not your choice. You're right. Draven stepped closer. It's not my choice. It's fate or curses or blood magic or whatever the fuck is destroying you from the inside. But I'm done letting forces I can't control take everything that matters. Can't fix this. Maybe not. His hand covered hers where it still rested against his chest. But I can refuse to surrender until there's no options left. Selene's expression shifted. For just a moment, the woman he'd married broke through the survival instincts. Her eyes cleared, her breathing steadied, and she looked at him with recognition that went beyond physical memory. She remembered who they'd been together. Then the clarity faded again. Her eyes went distant. The moment passed, but it had been there. Proof that pieces of Selene still existed beneath the curse's damage. Proof that she wasn't completely gone yet. Draven made his decision. I'm taking you back to the capital, not to a cage, not to a prison, but to every healer and scholar and ancient text the Empire can access. If there's even a chance someone knows how to break this curse, I'm going to find them, Selene wrote frantically. Tried already. No cure. Then we'll make one. Draven's tone left no room for argument. You said your family searched for centuries, but your family wasn't ruling an empire with resources that can buy forbidden knowledge from every corner of the world. They weren't willing to burn everything down to save one person. He saw the conflict in her eyes. The part that wanted to believe fighting against the part that had already accepted death. Come back with me. He caught her shaking hands in his. Not as my queen, not as some symbol for the empire. Just as the woman I'm not ready to lose yet. Let me try fixing this before you disappear completely. The wolves had gathered in a circle around them, watching, waiting. Like they understood this moment decided whether their ghost woman stayed wild or returned to civilization. Selene looked at them, then back at Draven, then down at her hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Finally, she nodded once. Sharp, decisive, the way she'd always made choices before the curse. Draven exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was freezing despite having survived here for 3 years. The warriors were stunned when Draven returned to camp carrying an unconscious Selene. She'd collapsed halfway back from exhaustion and blood loss and probably shock at agreeing to return. Is that really? General Markoth started then stopped when Draven's expression made finishing the question seem dangerous. Prepare to ride back. We leave at dawn. That night, Draven sat beside Selene while she slept fitfully near the fire. The mate bond pulsed irregularly in his chest, sometimes strong, sometimes barely there, like a heartbeat fighting to stay steady. He'd spent 3 years believing she was dead, 3 years ruling through mechanical efficiency while grief hollowed him out, 3 years building walls around the parts of himself that had cared about anything beyond maintaining power. Finding her alive should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of another abyss. Because bringing her back meant fighting forces he didn't understand with weapons he didn't possess. Meant confronting the reality that empires built on strength couldn't solve every problem through superior force. And if he failed again, he'd have to watch her fade in real time instead of just believing she was gone. That was the cruel mathematics of hope. It gave you something to fight for while guaranteeing the loss would destroy you if you failed. But Draven had learned one truth during 3 years of ruling while half dead. Destruction didn't scare him anymore. He'd already survived the worst version of loss. Everything else was just degrees of catastrophe. So when dawn broke over the mountains, he carried Selene to his horse and started the journey back to Vaelor. Behind them, the wolves howled like they were mourning or celebrating or both. And ahead of them waited an empire that had no idea their dead queen was coming home. They arrived in the capital 7 days later during a snowstorm that turned the city white. Draven had sent riders ahead to prepare the palace, but kept Selene's return secret from everyone except his most trusted advisors. The fewer people who knew, the fewer opportunities for assassination or political exploitation. Because bringing back a cursed queen who'd been legally declared dead created problems that went beyond emotional reunion. There were succession questions, political complications, noble houses who'd already started positioning themselves for a future without her. And there was Cassian. Draven's brother had spent 3 years building a support network that assumed Selene was permanently gone and the throne would eventually pass to him. Finding out she'd returned would destabilize every calculation he'd made, which meant he'd become dangerous. Draven carried Selene through private corridors into the royal chambers where they'd spent their last night together 3 years ago. Nothing had changed. He'd left everything exactly as it had been. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Her jewelry sat on the vanity. Even the papers she'd written on that final night remained scattered across the desk. A shrine to grief disguised as unchanged rooms. He placed her on the bed and she woke immediately, those violet eyes snapping open with the hyper-alertness of someone who'd survived by never sleeping deeply. Where? Her mouth formed the word silently. Home. Draven pulled back the curtains, showing the city beyond. You're back in the palace. Selene sat up slowly. She looked around the chambers with an expression that shifted between recognition and confusion, like she remembered this place but couldn't quite believe she'd returned. Then her hand went to her swollen belly. Still pregnant after 3 years, still carrying a child trapped in suspended development by the curse's interrupted transformation. The healers will examine you within the hour. Draven sat in a chair positioned where he could watch both her and the door. They'll figure out what's keeping the baby frozen and how to... Selene grabbed paper from the bedside table and wrote quickly. Need to know what happened while gone. So Draven told her. He explained how the Empire believed she'd been killed, how he'd staged the scene and hunted the bear in rage-fueled grief, how he'd ruled for 3 years while half dead inside, how Cassian had built a political network positioning himself as the future king. He left out the worst parts. The nights he'd stood on that balcony contemplating whether ruling an empire mattered if everything that gave it meaning was gone. The violence that had escalated beyond strategic necessity into something darker. The way he'd discovered that rage felt better than helplessness. Selene listened to everything, then wrote, You changed. Everyone changes. Draven met her eyes. Difference is whether the change makes you weaker or just harder. Which are you? Both. The truth sat between them. 3 years had transformed Draven from a ruler who used violence strategically into someone who used it as emotional release. From a king who maintained control through calculated dominance into someone barely holding himself together through sheer force of will. And now Selene was back. Changed, cursed, fading, reminding him exactly how much power didn't matter when fate decided to destroy what you loved. Footsteps approached the door. The head healer entered with 3 assistants carrying medical equipment. They froze when they saw Selene sitting on the bed, very much alive. Your Majesty. The healer's voice came out shocked. We were told to prepare for examination, but no one said, Just fix her. Draven stood. Whatever it costs. Whatever resources you need. I want her stable and the curse broken. The healer swallowed hard. We'll do everything possible. No. Draven moved close enough that the woman had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. You'll do everything impossible. Because possible hasn't worked and I'm done accepting limitations. The healers worked while Draven watched from the corner. They examined Selene thoroughly. Drew blood, checked vital signs. Pressed instruments against her abdomen, measuring the frozen pregnancy. After 2 hours, the head healer approached Draven with the kind of careful expression people wore when delivering news that might get them executed. Your Majesty, the situation is complex. The Queen's wolf spirit is trapped in partial transformation. The pregnancy appears stable but hasn't progressed in years. Her memory and cognitive function are deteriorating at an accelerating rate. We've never seen anything like this. Then find someone who has. Draven's tone remained flat. Bring me every scholar who studies blood magic, every exiled witch who might know curses, every ancient text hidden in private collections. I don't care how forbidden or dangerous the knowledge is. That kind of search could take months. The healer hesitated, and even then, breaking a bloodline curse might require... I didn't ask for warnings. Draven cut her off. I asked for solutions. Get started. The healers left. Selene watched them go, then turned to Draven and wrote, Why? Why what? Why fight this? Let me fade. Easier. For who? Draven sat on the bed beside her. For you? For me? For some abstract concept of mercy that makes everyone feel better about giving up? Selene underlined her next words. I'm already dead. Just taking time. Maybe. He didn't look away from those violet eyes that still held fragments of the woman he'd married. But I watched you run into those mountains 3 years ago and did nothing. Made the choice to let you face death alone. I'm not making that mistake again. Not mistake, my choice. Your choice was dying free instead of trapped. Draven caught her hand. I'm not offering you a cage this time. I'm offering you every resource an empire can provide to fight something that's trying to erase you. If you still want to fade after we've tried everything, I'll respect that. But I need to know we exhausted every option first. The mate bond pulsed between them. Damaged but present. A connection that had survived 3 years of separation and was now struggling against forces that wanted to sever it permanently. Selene stared at him for a long moment. Then she wrote one final message. Okay, try. 2 words that meant everything, because trying meant hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing they could carry into a fight against fate itself. But dangerous had never stopped either of them before. Outside the windows, Vylor spread beneath them in layers of torchlight and falling snow. An empire that had no idea their dead queen had returned. An empire that was about to discover the King Alpha they'd feared for 3 years was capable of something far more terrifying than rage. obsession. And when word finally spread through the noble houses that Selene lived, when Cassian discovered his carefully built succession plans were threatened, when ancient forces that thrived on bloodline curses realized someone was trying to break their power, the real war would begin. Not for territory or resources or political advantage, but for a single life that two people had decided mattered more than kingdoms. That was the secret no throne ever admitted. Power wasn't measured by what you conquered. It was measured by what you were willing to destroy to protect what you loved. And Draven Kaelthorn was willing to burn the entire world down if that's what saving Selene required. Word spread through the palace like poison in water. The dead queen had returned, alive, changed, cursed. The servants whispered it in corridors. The guards muttered it during shift changes. Within hours, every noble house in the capital knew that Selene Valaris had somehow survived 3 years in the wilderness and now occupied the royal chambers again. The political tremors started immediately. Draven felt them during the emergency council meeting he'd called at dawn. 12 advisors sat around the strategy table wearing expressions that ranged from shock to calculation to poorly concealed panic. These were men who'd spent 3 years adjusting to a grief-stricken king and a succession path that ran through Cassian. Selene's return destroyed every assumption they'd built their political futures on. General Markoth spoke first. Your Majesty, the implications of the Queen's survival are significant. There are legal questions about her status given she was officially declared deceased, property transfers, succession rights, international treaties that assumed... I don't care about legal technicalities. Draven cut him off. My maid is alive. Everything else adjusts around that fact. With respect. Lord Vareth leaned forward. The Empire operates on legal frameworks. We can't simply ignore 3 years of precedent because... Watch me. The command in those 2 words shut down further argument. Draven had spent 3 years learning that grief made him dangerous in ways calculation never had. The nobles recognized it. They'd watched him evolve from strategic brutality into something raw, more volatile. They feared him now in a way they hadn't before Selene disappeared. Good. Fear kept empires stable when love couldn't. The Queen will resume her position. Draven's tone left no room for debate. The healers are working to stabilize her condition. I've authorized unlimited resources to research the curse affecting her bloodline. Any scholar, witch, or ancient text that might contain relevant knowledge will be brought to the capital regardless of cost or legal restrictions. That could create diplomatic incidents. Another advisor spoke carefully. Some of that knowledge is forbidden for reasons involving international treaties, and then we'll deal with the diplomatic fallout after we save her life. Silence filled the room. Draven watched them process what he'd just said. He was declaring that Selene's survival mattered more than political stability, international relations, or legal precedent. It was the kind of statement that toppled kings who'd lost perspective on what power was supposed to protect. Draven didn't care. He'd already lost her once while maintaining perfect political form. This time he'd burn every treaty and shatter every diplomatic relationship if that's what breaking the curse required. Because here was the truth about absolute power that no throne ever admitted. Strength meant nothing if you had nothing worth protecting. Empires built purely on dominance lasted only until someone more ruthless came along. What separated temporary tyrants from lasting rulers was understanding that power served a purpose beyond its own perpetuation. Draven had spent 3 years ruling while half dead inside. He'd maintained control through mechanical efficiency and escalating violence. He'd kept the Empire functioning while the parts of him that cared about anything beyond survival slowly atrophied. Finding Selene alive had reminded him why he'd wanted the throne in the first place. Not for dominance, not for legacy, but to build something that protected what mattered when the rest of the world wanted to destroy it. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics and security protocols. The nobles asked questions that sounded practical, but carried subtext about power dynamics and succession uncertainty. Draven answered mechanically while his mind tracked a different problem. Cassian hadn't attended the meeting. His brother had been notified. Protocol demanded his presence at emergency council sessions, but the chair reserved for the prince remained empty. That absence meant something. After dismissing the council, Draven went looking for answers. He found them in Cassian's private chambers, where his brother sat drinking wine and staring out the window overlooking the city. You missed the meeting. Draven closed the door behind him. Did I? Cassian didn't turn around. Must have slipped my mind. The casual disrespect would have gotten anyone else executed, but Cassian had always been better at reading survival odds than showing proper deference. We need to talk about Selene's return. Draven moved closer. And what it means for succession planning. I know what it means. Cassian finally looked at him. It means 3 years of careful political positioning just became worthless. It means every noble house that was starting to see me as the future king now has to recalculate. It means I'm back to being the spare prince who'll never inherit anything. Is that why you're sulking like a child who lost his favorite toy? Cassian's expression hardened. You have no idea what the last 3 years have been like. Watching you fall apart. Holding this empire together while you turned governance into personal therapy through excessive violence. I've been the functional ruler everyone relied on while you were too broken to care about anything except grief. And you think that entitles you to what exactly? Draven kept his voice level. The throne? My gratitude? A guarantee that when I die you'll inherit an empire you helped maintain while I was compromised? I think it entitles me to honesty. Cassian stood. You're not going to save her, Draven. That curse has been killing women in her bloodline for centuries. You're going to pour resources into a hopeless fight while the empire destabilizes around you. And when she dies anyway, you'll be even more broken than before. The words cut deeper than Cassian probably intended, because there was truth in them. Draven was gambling everything on a solution that might not exist, risking political stability for a personal crusade that could fail spectacularly. But the alternative was watching Selene fade without fighting, and he'd already made that mistake once. If you're planning something, Draven stepped closer. If you're thinking about using this situation to make a move for the throne, remember what happened to the last person who challenged my authority? I'm not planning anything. Cassian met his eyes without flinching. I'm just watching my brother choose a woman over an empire, and wondering when you'll realize that kings don't get to prioritize personal love over political responsibility. Then you've never understood what makes someone worth following. Draven turned toward the door. Power without something worth protecting is just violence with better PR. He left before Cassian could respond, but the conversation confirmed what Draven's instincts had been screaming since returning to the capital. His brother was a threat, not an immediate one. Cassian was too smart to make obvious moves while Draven remained alert. But the resentment was there, the ambition, the calculation about when grief might create opportunities. Draven would need to watch him carefully. The problem was he had too many other threats to track simultaneously, and that was the curse of ruling from the top. Everyone below you became a potential enemy. Every supporter calculated their loyalty against self-interest. Every family member measured their proximity to power against their desire for more. Thrones didn't create trust. They destroyed it systematically, until paranoia became the only rational response to human interaction. Draven had accepted that truth when he took the crown at 18, but watching his own brother position himself as a rival still carried a bitter taste that no amount of political pragmatism could sweeten. Kick in. The scholars arrived over the next week. Draven had sent riders to every corner of the empire with instructions to bring back anyone who studied blood magic, ancient curses, or forbidden medical knowledge. Gold bought cooperation from most. Threats motivated the rest. By the 8th day, 15 experts occupied palace chambers converted into research facilities. They pored over ancient texts, examined Selene repeatedly, debated theories in multiple languages while servants brought them food and wine. Draven attended every session. He stood in the corner watching them work while his mate underwent examination after examination. Blood draws, physical assessments, questions about her symptoms that she answered by writing on paper because her voice remained gone. The curse had been thorough. It hadn't just attacked her wolf spirit, it had started erasing everything that made her human. Voice first, memory second. Soon she'd lose the ability to recognize faces, then emotions, then the capacity to understand she'd ever been anything other than a beast trapped in human skin. Watching it happen in slow motion was worse than believing she'd died quickly. Because death was clean. Final. Something you grieved and eventually moved past. But this was watching someone disappear piece by piece while they remained physically present. Selene would look at him with those violet eyes, and he could see the moments when recognition flickered, When she knew who he was versus when he became just another face in a world losing meaning, it was psychological torture dressed up as hope. One of the scholars, an elderly woman named Myrith, who specialized in bloodline curses, finally confirmed what Draven had suspected. This isn't natural magic. Myrith stood before a chalkboard covered in diagrams. It's older, something woven into the family bloodline at the genetic level centuries ago, possibly as punishment for some transgression we can't trace anymore. Can it be broken? Draven didn't care about historical context. Theoretically. Myrith hedged carefully, but the cost would be extreme. Blood magic this powerful doesn't just dissipate. It needs to be transferred or absorbed by someone willing to take on the burden. Meaning, what exactly? Meaning someone would need to accept half the curse's effects themselves. Another scholar spoke up. Share the deterioration. The original victim would stabilize but never fully heal. The person accepting the transfer would begin aging at an accelerated rate, losing years of their lifespan to balance the equation. How many years? Draven kept his voice neutral. 20, maybe more depending on how deeply rooted the curse has become. The scholar looked uncomfortable. And there's no guarantee the transfer will work. The ritual itself is dangerous enough that most participants don't survive the process. If either party dies during the ceremony, the curse rebounds stronger than before. So the options are let her fade completely or risk both of us dying in a ritual that might fail anyway. Essentially, yes. The room went silent. Every scholar present understood what they were asking. They wanted Draven to gamble his life on magic that historically had a low success rate. Trade 20 years of his existence for a solution that might kill them both. From a pure risk assessment perspective, it was objectively stupid. But risk assessment assumed you were trying to optimize outcomes across probability distributions. It assumed you valued your own survival above all other variables. Draven had stopped caring about his own survival the moment he'd watched Selene run into those mountains 3 years ago. I'll do it. The words came out before conscious thought caught up. Your Majesty. General Markoth stepped forward. You need to consider the political implications. If you become physically weakened, there will be challenges to your authority. Rivals will see opportunity. The Empire could fracture. Then I'll hold it together through force of will instead of physical dominance. Draven turned to Myrith. What do you need to perform the ritual? Time to prepare. The scholar looked uncertain. 3 days minimum to gather materials and construct the ceremonial space. And we need to be absolutely certain the Queen consents. This kind of magic requires willing participants on both sides, or it fails catastrophically. She'll consent. Draven glanced at Selene where she sat on a medical table looking small and exhausted. Because the alternative is watching herself disappear completely. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Selene had chosen to face the curse alone 3 years ago, specifically to avoid burdening him. She'd staged her own death and fled into wilderness rather than watch him sacrifice anything for her survival. Would she accept a ritual that traded his lifespan for her stability? Or would she refuse and choose fading over watching him age prematurely? Draven didn't know, and that uncertainty ate at him worse than the physical risks of the ceremony itself. After the scholars dispersed, he approached Selene carefully. She looked up at him with eyes that flickered between clarity and confusion. The curse was accelerating. He could see it in how long recognition took now compared to even a few days ago. You heard what they said. Draven sat beside her on the medical table. About the ritual. Selene grabbed paper and wrote quickly. No, too much. Not worth it. That's not your decision to make. Is my curse, my choice. Her handwriting got more aggressive. Won't let you trade years for this, and you're my mate. Draven kept his voice low enough only she could hear. You made your choice 3 years ago when you ran into those mountains. Now it's my turn to choose. I'm not losing you again because I was too afraid of the cost. Selene's eyes filled with tears that tracked down her face silently. She wrote one more message. You'll regret this. Maybe. Draven brushed the tears away with his thumb. But I'll regret watching you fade even more. At least this way we both survive. Not surviving. Just dying slower. The brutal honesty cut through him. She was right. The ritual wouldn't cure her. It would just stabilize the deterioration at whatever point they performed it. She'd remain trapped between human and beast, unable to speak, losing memories gradually, never fully whole again. But she'd be alive, and that mattered more than perfect solutions. Because here was what Draven had learned during 3 years of ruling while half dead inside. Perfect solutions didn't exist. Every choice carried costs. Every decision meant sacrificing one thing to preserve another. The difference between wise rulers and foolish ones wasn't avoiding hard choices. It was understanding which sacrifices you could live with and which ones would hollow you out from the inside. Losing Selene the first time had nearly destroyed him. Watching her fade slowly while doing nothing would finish the job. But trading years of his life for her stability? That was a cost he could live with. That was a choice that let him look at himself without seeing a coward who'd prioritize political convenience over the person who mattered most. The scholars need 3 days to prepare. Draven stood. Use that time to decide if you can accept living like this. If the answer is no, tell me. I'll respect that choice. But if there's any part of you that wants to keep fighting, I need you to trust that I'm willing to pay the price. Selene stared at him for a long moment. Her expression shifted through emotions too complex to name. Fear, love, anger, resignation. Then she nodded once, sharp, decisive, the same way she'd always made choices before the curse. Cassian made his move on the second day. Draven was reviewing security protocols when guards dragged a captured assassin into the throne room. The man was bloodied from interrogation, but still breathing. Trained killers knew how to endure pain longer than normal people. This one had been caught trying to enter the royal chambers where Selene slept. Talk. Draven descended the throne steps. Who sent you? The assassin spat blood. Go to hell. Wrong answer. Draven grabbed the man's jaw and forced eye contact. You're going to tell me everything. Who hired you? How you got past security? What the target was? And if you lie, I'll make sure your death takes days instead of minutes. The assassin's resistance crumbled under the alpha command layered into those words. Against his will, he started talking. Prince Cassian. The words came out strangled. Hired me 2 weeks ago, before the queen returned. Contract was to eliminate her if she ever resurfaced. Insurance policy against succession complications. Everything in the throne room went silent. Draven felt something cold settle into his chest. Not surprise exactly. He'd suspected Cassian was positioning himself for a power grab. But having confirmation that his own brother had hired assassins to murder Selene crossed a line that made previous political maneuvering look innocent. This wasn't ambition. This was fratricide wrapped in strategic justification. And it confirmed something darker about the nature of power that Draven had been avoiding acknowledging. Thrones didn't just corrupt people who wanted them. They corrupted everyone in proximity to succession. Family became threat assessment. Brothers became rivals. Love became liability that ambitious people eliminated for political convenience. Cassian had grown up beside him, had trained with him, had supposedly been loyal through decades of shared history. But proximity to power had transformed that brother into someone willing to murder Selene the moment she threatened his path to the throne. That was the real curse. Not the blood magic destroying Selene from the inside, but the way power poisoned human connection until nothing remained except calculation and betrayal. Where is Prince Cassian now? Draven's voice came out too quiet. His chambers. The assassin coughed. Waiting to hear if I succeeded. Draven turned to his guards. Arrest him. Bring him to the throne room in chains. If he resists, break whatever bones necessary to ensure compliance. The guards scattered. Draven stood alone in the throne room processing the magnitude of his brother's betrayal. Part of him had known this was coming, had seen the signs building over 3 years. But knowing something intellectually was different from feeling the reality of it slam into you. Cassian had looked at Selene, pregnant with a child that shared their bloodline, and decided her death was acceptable collateral for political advancement. That kind of calculation required a special type of moral bankruptcy that even Draven's brutal approach to governance hadn't reached. 20 minutes later, guards dragged Cassian into the throne room. Draven's brother fought the entire way, shouting about illegal detention and demanding formal charges. The guards threw him down before the throne hard enough that he hit the marble floor with force that drew blood from his lip. Cassian looked up at Draven with defiance that hadn't quite transformed into fear yet. "You can't do this!" His voice echoed across the chamber. "I'm a prince of the royal bloodline. There are legal processes for—" "Legal processes." Draven cut him off. "You hired an assassin to murder the queen and you're lecturing me about legal processes. That's a lie." Cassian climbed to his feet despite the guards holding his arms. "Whatever that killer told you, he told me you paid him 2 weeks ago, before Selene returned, that you wanted insurance against succession complications." Draven descended the steps slowly. "Were you planning to have me killed too eventually, or just wait for grief to finish destroying me while you positioned yourself as the stable alternative?" Cassian's expression shifted. The defiance cracked just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "You're weak." His voice dropped lower. "You've been weak since she disappeared. The Empire needs a ruler who doesn't prioritize personal obsession over political stability. I was preparing for when your grief finally made you unable to govern. So you thought you'd accelerate the timeline by murdering my mate. I thought I'd prevent you from destabilizing everything our family built just to chase a hopeless cure for a dying woman." Cassian's voice rose. "She's cursed, Draven. Doomed. Pouring resources into saving her while ignoring the Empire's actual needs is the definition of failed leadership." The words hung in the air like accusations. Because again, there was truth buried in the justification. Draven was gambling the Empire's stability on a personal crusade, pouring resources into breaking a curse that might be unbreakable, choosing love over political wisdom. Everything kings weren't supposed to do. But that was the part Cassian had never understood. Power without something worth protecting was just empty dominance. Thrones built on pure calculation lasted only until someone more ruthless came along. What Draven had with Selene was the thing that made ruling worth the cost, and his brother had tried to destroy it for political convenience. "You know what the difference is between us?" Draven stepped closer. "You think love is weakness. You think caring about something more than power makes me vulnerable. But the truth is simpler. I'm willing to burn the entire empire down to protect what matters. You're only willing to protect what advances your ambition. That's not strength. That's just cowardice wearing strategic justification." "I'm a coward?" Cassian's laugh carried no humor. "You're the one who spent 3 years pretending to rule while falling apart internally. I held this empire together. You held nothing." Draven's voice dropped to something dangerous. "You positioned yourself, built networks, calculated angles, but you never carried the actual weight of ruling. You just waited in the shadows, hoping my grief would create opportunity." The throne room filled with tension thick enough to cut. Guards shifted nervously. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would reshape the Empire's power structure. The sentence came easier than it should have. "You're stripped of title." Draven pronounced judgment with the same cold efficiency he'd always used for executions. "Exiled from Vialor with nothing but the clothes you're wearing. If you're found within Empire borders after sunset tomorrow, you'll be executed on sight." "You can't exile me." Cassian's voice rose. "I'm your brother, your blood. The nobles will never accept." "The nobles will accept what I tell them to accept." Draven gestured to the guards. "Remove him. Make sure everyone sees a prince reduced to nothing on his way out of the city." "Brother, please." Cassian's defiance finally broke into desperation. "I was protecting the Empire, protecting you from yourself. You can't throw away your family for..." "For what?" Draven stepped closer. "For the woman you tried to murder? For the mate I spent 3 years believing was dead? You're right that I can't throw away family, but you stopped being family the moment you hired killers to eliminate her." The guards dragged Cassian toward the exit. He fought them screaming about injustice and betrayal, and how history would judge this decision. Draven watched him disappear through the palace doors. Then he stood alone in the throne room, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. Cassian had been ambitious and calculating, but he'd also been right about some things. The Empire did need stable leadership. Draven was gambling everything on a cure that might not exist. The political foundation was fracturing, but some choices transcended strategic wisdom. Some choices came down to whether you were willing to protect what mattered, even when logic said you should sacrifice it for greater good. Draven had made his choice 3 years ago when he'd let Selene run into those mountains. That mistake had haunted him every day since. He wouldn't compound it by prioritizing Empire stability over her survival now. Even if it meant ruling from a position of weakness, even if it meant facing challenges from rivals who sensed vulnerability, even if it meant the throne itself became secondary to the person who made ruling worth the cost. Because that was the final truth about power that no crown ever admitted. Strength wasn't measured by what you conquered. It was measured by what you refused to surrender when everyone watching called you weak for holding on. Basit. The ritual took place 3 nights later under a full moon. The scholars had prepared the tower room at the palace's highest point. Silver dust formed intricate patterns across the floor. Black candles burned at cardinal points. Ancient texts lay open on tables showing diagrams of magic that predated the empire itself. It looked like something out of forbidden history, the kind of blood magic that kingdoms had outlawed because the costs were too brutal and the success rates too low. But desperate times destroyed the luxury of ethical boundaries. Selene stood in the circle wearing simple white robes. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure. The pregnancy showed more clearly now that palace food had helped her regain weight. 7 months along but frozen in development by the curse's interrupted transformation. Their child suspended in time, waiting to see if magic could break what blood had created. Draven joined her in the circle. 15 scholars surrounded them, chanting in languages so old that translation had become guesswork. The air felt heavy. Wrong. Like reality was bending around forces it wasn't designed to contain. Mirith approached carrying a blade made from black glass. "This is your last chance to reconsider," her voice cut through the chanting. "Once we start, stopping means death for both of you. The curse will rebound if the transfer is interrupted." "We're not stopping." Draven held Selene's gaze. "Start the ritual." Mirith cut his palm first, then Selene's. Blood welled from both wounds, dark and thick. The scholar pressed their hands together, and the moment their blood touched, everything changed. The curse attacked. Draven felt it like razors cutting through his nervous system. The magic buried in Selene's bloodline recognized the transfer and fought violently. His vision went white. His knees buckled, but he forced himself to remain standing. Across from him, Selene screamed without sound. The mate bond became a conduit for 3 years of accumulated suffering. Everything Selene had endured flooded into Draven in seconds. The slow erasure of identity, the confusion as memories disappeared, the terror of feeling yourself dissolve piece by piece while remaining conscious enough to understand what was happening. He experienced all of it while his body began aging rapidly. Pain exploded through every muscle as time compressed unnaturally. Draven felt his joints stiffen. His hair turned silver. Wrinkles carved into his face like battle scars written by decades instead of years. Strength drained from his limbs. The physical dominance that had defined his entire existence simply evaporated. 20 years vanished from him in minutes. But across from him, Selene's eyes cleared. The confusion faded. Her wolf spirit stabilized at whatever damaged level it had reached. The curse stopped actively devouring her humanity and settled into an uncomfortable stasis. She would never fully heal, would never speak again, would lose memories gradually over years instead of months. But she wouldn't disappear completely. The ritual reached its peak. Silver light filled the tower room so bright it burned through closed eyelids. Draven heard Selene crying, felt her hand gripping his hard enough to break bones that had suddenly become more fragile than they'd been minutes ago. The scholars' chanting rose to a crescendo that made the air vibrate. Then everything went silent. The light faded. The chanting stopped. Draven collapsed to his knees as exhaustion crashed through him, like nothing he'd ever experienced. His body felt wrong, foreign, like wearing someone else's skin that didn't fit properly. Across the circle, Selene dropped beside him, breathing hard but steady. They knelt there facing each other while the scholars watched in tense silence. Mirith stepped forward, checking vital signs with shaking hands. She examined Draven first, pressed fingers against his neck, measuring pulse, looked into his eyes, checking for signs of permanent damage. After several minutes, she looked up at the other scholars and nodded once. It worked. Her voice carried relief and shock in equal measure. The curse has been partially transferred. Both survived the process. Draven tried standing and discovered his body no longer responded the way it had 20 minutes ago. His strength had diminished to maybe half what it used to be. His reflexes had slowed. His endurance had cratered. He looked down at hands that now showed age spots and prominent veins, touched his face and felt wrinkles that hadn't existed before the ceremony. He'd traded 2 decades of physical dominance for whatever damaged time Selene had left. Worth it. Selene crawled toward him, moving with effort that showed the ritual had cost her too. When she got close enough, she pressed her forehead against his and whispered something that came out as broken syllables instead of words. But Draven understood anyway. She was saying thank you in the only way the curse still allowed. He wrapped his arms around her while the scholars cleaned up ritual materials and the moon set beyond the tower windows. They'd survived, both damaged, both changed, but alive. The mate bond pulsed steadily in his chest for the first time in 3 years. Not perfect, not whole, but present. And that was enough. Behind them, palace healers entered to examine them both more thoroughly. They asked questions about pain levels and cognitive function, gave instructions about recovery protocols and medication schedules. Draven answered mechanically while holding Selene against his chest. The Empire outside had no idea what had just happened in that tower. They were about to find out, because ruling from a position of physical weakness would invite challenges Draven had never faced when strength made him untouchable. The nobles who'd feared him would start calculating whether an aging king could maintain control. Rivals would test his borders, sensing vulnerability. And somewhere in exile, Cassian would hear about the ritual and recognize opportunity. But that was tomorrow's war. Tonight, Draven held his mate while exhaustion pulled them both toward unconsciousness, while Selene's breathing evened out into something approaching normal, while the physical cost of magic settled into bodies that would never be the same again. He'd made his choice, sacrificed strength for love, traded physical dominance for whatever broken future they could build together. The scholars had warned him most people didn't survive transfers like this, but most people had never loved someone enough to consider dying worth the attempt. And in the cold mathematics of power versus sacrifice, Draven had learned one final truth that would define everything that came next. Thrones didn't belong to the strongest ruler. They belonged to whoever refused to surrender what mattered most. Even when refusing looked like suicide to everyone watching, even when the cost was everything you'd built your identity around, even when winning meant losing the very thing that made you powerful in the first place, that was the point of no return. And Draven had crossed it without hesitation. Dawn broke over Valor with blood-red light that painted the palace towers the color of old wounds. Draven stood on the balcony overlooking the city, feeling his new body's limitations with every breath. 3 days had passed since the ritual. 3 days of his muscles refusing to respond the way they had for 36 years. 3 days of discovering that strength he'd taken for granted had simply vanished along with 2 decades of his life. He looked older, moved slower, felt the weight of armor he used to wear without thinking. But Selene was alive. She slept in the chambers behind him, finally resting without the curse actively devouring her from the inside. Still damaged, still trapped between forms, but stable. Worth it. Below in the courtyard, guards trained with weapons that caught morning light. The Empire continued functioning with mechanical precision. Trade caravans departed for border territories. Administrators processed documents. Life went on. But Draven could feel the shift happening beneath the surface. Word had spread about the ritual, about their king sacrificing 2 decades of strength to save a cursed queen. The nobles weren't whispering anymore. They were calculating openly. General Markoth approached from behind, footsteps deliberately loud so Draven would hear him coming. The old warrior had been loyal for 15 years, but even loyalty got tested when power dynamics shifted this dramatically. "Your Majesty?" Markoth stopped at a respectful distance. "We need to discuss the northern borders." "What about them?" 3 separate incidents in the last 2 days. Raiders testing our defenses, small groups but coordinated, like they're probing for weakness. Of course they were. News traveled fast in territories where survival depended on reading power shifts correctly. The Empire's enemies had heard about a weakened king, and they were testing whether the rumors were true. "Send additional battalions." Draven kept his eyes on the city. "Fortify the mountain passes. Any raiding party that crosses our borders gets eliminated completely. No survivors to report back." "That's the issue." Markoth hesitated. "The commanders are asking if you'll be leading the campaign personally. Why would that matter?" "Because you always have before." The general's voice carried careful neutrality. "Your presence on battlefields made enemies surrender before fighting started. Now they're wondering if the king who aged 20 years in one night can still back up his reputation with force. There it was. The question everyone was thinking, but only Markoth had the courage to ask directly. Could Draven still lead from the front? Could a king who'd sacrificed his physical dominance maintain control through presence alone? The answer was complicated. His strength had diminished, but his strategic mind remained sharp. His body was weaker, but his willingness to use violence hadn't changed. He could still rule effectively. But effectiveness wasn't the same as dominance. And empires built on alpha strength respected dominance more than competence. That was the mathematics he'd ignored when choosing the ritual. Power had never been just about making good decisions. It was about projecting invincibility. Making enemies believe challenging you meant certain death. Draven had traded invincibility for love. Now he'd discover whether an empire could be held together through force of will when physical force had diminished. Tell the commanders I'll ride north within the week. His voice carried the same command it always had. Anyone questioning whether I can still lead can test their theory against reality. Your Majesty, with respect, you're not recovered from the ritual. Riding into combat now could what? Draven finally turned to face him. Could get me killed? I've been willing to die for this empire since the day I took the crown. That hasn't changed just because my body aged, but the empire needs to remember that strength isn't just muscle and speed. Draven cut him off. It's also knowing what you're willing to sacrifice and what you refuse to surrender. I made my choice. Now everyone else gets to decide if they can follow a king who prioritizes different things than raw dominance. Markoth studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll inform the commanders. We ride in 5 days. 3 days, Draven corrected. We ride in 3 days. The longer we wait, the more our enemies think hesitation means fear. The general left without further argument. Smart man. He'd learned over 15 years that once Draven made a decision, pushing back only wasted energy. Behind him, Selene emerged from the chambers, moving with the careful steps of someone still learning their body's new limitations. The curse had stabilized but left her fundamentally changed. She moved like a predator, trying to remember how to be human. You're going north. She didn't speak the words. She wrote them on paper she carried everywhere now. Yes. To prove you're still strong. Ikar. To prove I'm still willing to defend what's mine. Draven took the paper and pen from her. There's a difference, Selene wrote quickly. They want you dead. All of them. Nobles, enemies, even your own commanders. They see weakness. Let them see what they want. Draven handed the materials back. Perception only matters if you let it control your decisions. I chose you over strength. Now I'll show them that choice doesn't equal surrender. She stared at him with those violet eyes that still held fragments of the fierce intelligence he'd fallen for. Even damaged by the curse, Selene understood power dynamics better than most rulers. She knew he was riding into a situation where perception could become reality, where enemies would test his resolve specifically because they sensed vulnerability, where one failure could cascade into a collapse of authority he might not recover from. But she also knew he didn't have a choice. Empires built on dominance required constant proof of strength. Any hesitation got interpreted as weakness. Any weakness invited challenges. Draven had to demonstrate that aging 20 years hadn't broken his capacity for violence. Otherwise, the empire would fracture beneath him while he watched helplessly. That was the trap he'd walked into when choosing the ritual. He'd saved Selene but created political instability that now demanded he risk everything to stabilize. And the cruelest part was understanding that even success might not be enough. Because once perception shifted from invincible to merely dangerous, rivals started calculating odds differently. Selene wrote one more message. I'm sorry. For what? For being the reason you're vulnerable now. Draven pulled her close despite her resistance. You're not the reason. The curse is. And I'd make the same choice again, knowing exactly what it cost. She pressed her forehead against his chest, while her shoulders shook with silent crying. All that strength she'd shown surviving in the mountains for 3 years crumbling against the reality that Draven had endangered himself to save her. That was love's cruelest equation. It meant caring so much that another person's suffering became worse than your own. It meant sacrificing pieces of yourself and watching them understand the cost. 3 days later, Draven rode north with 500 warriors. He wore full armor despite how the weight pressed against joints that weren't as resilient as they'd been a week ago. Sat on his war horse despite how riding for hours would exhaust him in ways it never had before. Projected strength despite feeling it drain from him with every mile. The warriors watched him carefully. They'd followed him into battle for years, trusting that his presence guaranteed victory. Now they were measuring whether an aged king could still back up that reputation. Draven felt their doubt like pressure against his skin. On the fourth day, they reached the northern territories where raiders had been testing defenses. The evidence was clear: burned outposts, slaughtered patrols, messages written in blood on stone walls. The enemy wanted Vaelor to know they were being hunted. General Markoth studied the tactical situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 40 years reading battlefields. "Your Majesty, this is coordinated. Multiple groups working together. They've scouted our positions thoroughly." "How many?" "Best estimate? 300 fighters. Well-trained. Probably mercenaries hired by someone with resources and motivation to destabilize our borders." "Cashin." Draven said it without hesitation. "It would make sense." Markoth agreed carefully. "Your brother was exiled with nothing but had 3 years to build networks. If he's been stockpiling gold and favors, hiring mercenaries to attack while you're vulnerable would be the logical move." Of course it would. Cassian had always been strategic. He'd watched Draven sacrifice strength for Selene and recognized opportunity. Now he was testing whether an aged king could still defend territory against organized assault. It was the kind of calculated betrayal that made perfect sense from a pure power dynamics perspective. It also meant Draven couldn't just repel the raiders. He'd need to send a message brutal enough that future challenges became unthinkable. Set a trap. Draven studied the map showing terrain and attack patterns. Let them think they've isolated a patrol. When they attack, spring the ambush with overwhelming force. "That puts our people at risk," Markoth pointed out. "Using soldiers as bait. Volunteers only." Draven cut him off. "And I'll be with the bait group. Absolutely not." The general's voice went sharp. "Your Majesty, that's tactically insane. If you're captured or killed, the Empire... If I hide behind walls while my soldiers take risks, the Empire learns their king has become a coward." Draven met his eyes. "I need to be in the fight, not directing from safety, actually bleeding beside the warriors who are supposed to believe I'm still worth following." Silence filled the command tent. Every officer present understood what Draven was really saying. He was gambling his life on one battle, betting that he could still fight effectively despite his diminished strength. Risking everything on the assumption that will and experience could compensate for lost physical dominance. It was objectively reckless, strategically questionable, the kind of decision that got kings killed and empires destabilized. But it was also the only move that addressed the real problem: perception, doubt, the creeping sense among his own forces that Draven had become a liability instead of an asset. Sometimes the only way to kill doubt was to force everyone to confront reality head-on. The ambush was set for the following night. Draven rode out with 20 volunteers into territory where raiders had been most active. They made themselves obvious, set camp in an exposed valley, posted minimal guards, perfect bait for enemies who thought they'd found isolated prey. The attack came 2 hours after sunset. Raiders poured into the valley from 3 directions simultaneously. 50 fighters moving with professional coordination. They hit the camp expecting easy victory against outnumbered soldiers. Instead, they found themselves surrounded as 300 Vaelor warriors emerged from concealed positions and sealed the trap. The fighting was brutal and fast. Draven moved through the chaos with a sword that felt heavier than it used to, and reflexes that responded a fraction slower than muscle memory expected. His first opponent came at him with an axe, and Draven barely deflected the blow in time. Before the ritual, that counter would have been effortless. Now it required conscious thought and effort that made him vulnerable to the follow-up strike. The axe caught his shoulder. Pain exploded through his arm. Blood ran hot beneath armor. Draven killed the raider anyway, drove his sword through the man's throat, and moved to the next target without acknowledging the wound. Around him, the battle raged. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed. Bodies fell into mud that turned red under torchlight. Draven fought through all of it, feeling his limitations with every movement. His endurance wasn't what it used to be. His strength had diminished enough that blocks that should have turned blades completely only deflected them partially. He was getting hit more than he ever had before. But he kept fighting. Because this wasn't about winning flawlessly. It was about demonstrating that diminished strength didn't equal broken will. That an aging king could still stand on battlefields and bleed beside his warriors. Perception mattered, and right now, 500 soldiers were watching their king fight through injuries that would have made younger men retreat. The raiders broke after 20 minutes. Those who could flee scattered into the darkness. The ones who couldn't died where they stood. Valor's forces took minimal casualties. The trap had worked perfectly from a tactical perspective. But Draven had 3 wounds that needed immediate attention and exhaustion that made standing require conscious effort. General Markoth reached him as the fighting ended. "Your Majesty, you're injured. We need to—" "I'm fine." Draven's voice came out steady despite how his vision kept blurring at the edges. "Secure the perimeter. I want prisoners interrogated within the hour. You're bleeding heavily." The general gestured toward the shoulder wound. "At least let the healers—" After interrogation. Draven forced himself to remain upright through sheer will. The warriors are watching. If I show weakness now, everything we just accomplished gets undermined. It was true. The soldiers were gathering around the battlefield watching their king stand among the dead, despite injuries that had blood running down his armor in steady streams. They needed to see him functional, dominant, still capable of leading even after aging 20 years. So Draven stood there while prisoners were dragged forward for questioning, while his own wounds screamed for attention and exhaustion threatened to drop him where he stood. The first prisoner confirmed what Draven already knew. "Prince Cassian hired us." The man spat blood, paid in advance, said the empire was weak and the king was vulnerable, said now was the time to strike. "Where is Cassian now?" The prisoner hesitated. Then fear won over loyalty, holed up in the eastern mountains. 3 days' ride from here. He's got maybe 200 fighters left, waiting to hear how this raid went before committing to full assault. So his brother was close, had been watching, waiting to see if Draven could still defend territory before risking direct confrontation. Classic Cassian, calculating, patient, willing to sacrifice hired mercenaries to gather intelligence before making his real move. But now Draven knew where he was, and proximity meant opportunity. "We ride east." Draven turned to Markoth. "Now, before Cassian hears this raid failed and repositions. Your Majesty, you're in no condition?" The general started. "I'm in the only condition that matters." Draven cut him off. "Still breathing, still capable of putting my brother down before he destabilizes the Empire further. That's enough. You need medical attention. At least let the healers stabilize." "No time." Draven moved toward his horse despite how his legs threatened to give out. "Cassian is 3 days away. If we move now, we can reach him while he's still vulnerable. Every hour we wait gives him chance to fortify or flee. This is suicide." Markoth grabbed his arm. "You're wounded and exhausted. Riding for 3 days in this condition will kill you before we reach the target." "Maybe." Draven pulled free. "But dying trying to end this threat is better than surviving while my brother rallies forces that tear the Empire apart piece by piece." The warriors were listening, all of them, measuring their king's determination against the obvious reality of his physical limitations. This was the moment that defined everything. If Draven showed weakness now, if he accepted medical treatment and rest while Cassian escaped, the perception would shift permanently. An aged king who couldn't pursue threats immediately became a king who'd lost the capacity for decisive action. But if he rode east despite injuries and exhaustion, if he pushed through limitations that would stop normal men, then perception bent differently. An aged king willing to die pursuing threats became something more dangerous than simple physical dominance. He became inevitable, and inevitability commanded more respect than strength ever could. "Mount up!" Draven's voice carried across the battlefield. "We ride in 10 minutes. Anyone too injured to continue gets left with sufficient guard. Everyone else follows me east." The warriors moved, some reluctantly, some with the kind of grim determination that came from following leaders willing to die for causes that mattered. Markoth shook his head but started issuing orders anyway. Smart man. He recognized when arguing became pointless. 20 minutes later, 400 riders departed east through darkness. Draven led them despite blood loss that made his vision swim and exhaustion that turned every mile into an endurance test. He'd made his choice when performing the ritual, traded strength for love. Now he was discovering what that choice really meant. It meant ruling through will instead of dominance. It meant pushing past limitations that would have stopped the king he used to be. It meant accepting that every decision carried costs he'd never paid before, but it also meant something deeper that Draven was only beginning to understand. Physical strength had always been his foundation, the thing that made him untouchable. Losing it felt like losing his identity. Except identity was never really about the body. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice and what you refused to surrender when everything else got stripped away. Draven had sacrificed strength, but he'd refused to surrender purpose. And purpose without physical dominance became something sharper, more focused. It couldn't rely on intimidation alone, had to prove itself through action and will and the kind of stubborn determination that outlasted opponents who expected age to equal defeat. That was the lesson power never taught until you lost it. Dominance was easy, will was hard, but will lasted longer. They rode through the night and into the next day. Draven's wounds kept bleeding despite field dressings. His exhaustion deepened into something that felt like dying slowly. He stayed in the saddle anyway. On the second day, riders returned from advanced scouting positions. They'd found Cassian's encampment, confirmed numbers, mapped defensive positions. 200 fighters in a mountain stronghold that would be held to assault directly. Cassian had chosen his position well. High ground, limited approaches, natural defenses that multiplied the effective strength of his forces. A direct attack would cost half Draven's warriors and might fail anyway. General Markoth laid out the tactical assessment with brutal honesty. Your Majesty, this is a fortified position against superior numbers. We'd need siege equipment and time to reduce it properly. Rushing an assault would be catastrophic, so we don't assault directly. Draven studied the maps. We use the terrain against him, force him out of the stronghold and into open ground where our numbers matter. How exactly? Fire. Draven traced lines showing prevailing winds. The mountains are dry this season. We set controlled burns upwind of his position. Give him a choice between evacuating or burning alive. That could kill civilians if the fire spreads wrong, Markoth pointed out. These mountains have scattered settlements. Then we evacuate them first. Draven cut him off. Send riders to clear everyone within 5 miles. Give them 3 hours to move. Then we burn Cassian out of his hole. It was ruthless, destructive, the kind of tactic that prioritized results over collateral damage. Exactly the approach Draven had always used when faced with threats that required decisive action. The evacuations took 6 hours. Longer than planned because mountain settlements were scattered and suspicious of soldiers telling them to abandon their homes. But eventually, the territory cleared. Families fled to safety with whatever possessions they could carry. The mountains emptied of innocent people, leaving only Cassian and his hired fighters in the stronghold. Draven's forces set the fires at sunset, multiple ignition points creating a wall of flame that marched up the mountain driven by wind and dry vegetation. The inferno was visible for miles. Smoke filled the sky. Heat made the air shimmer even at distance. Inside the stronghold, Cassian's forces had 2 choices, burn or retreat. They chose retreat. 200 fighters poured out of the mountain fortress trying to escape the flames. They scattered in different directions, hoping to lose pursuit in the chaos. But Draven's warriors were waiting. The battle happened in a dozen different locations simultaneously, small groups of raiders running into prepared ambush positions. The coordination that had made Cassian's forces effective became their weakness when the stronghold fell apart. Draven rode through the chaos, hunting for one specific target, his brother. He found Cassian trying to flee south with a dozen personal guards. They'd almost cleared the ambush perimeter when Draven's group cut them off. The guards formed a defensive line. Cassian sat his horse behind them, looking genuinely shocked to see Draven present and functional. "You should be dead," his brother's voice carried across the distance. The reports said you could barely stand after the ritual. Reports were wrong. Draven dismounted despite how the motion sent fresh pain through his wounded shoulder. "I'm old, I'm slower, but I'm still here. And you're still a traitor who tried to murder my mate. I tried to save the Empire from your obsession." Cassian matched him by dismounting. "Everything I did was to prevent you from destroying what our family built. By hiring assassins." Draven drew his sword. "By attacking our borders. By burning resources trying to kill the woman I chose to save. The woman who's going to die anyway. Cassian pulled his own blade. You sacrificed 2 decades for someone who'll fade regardless. That's not love. That's delusion wearing romantic justification. Maybe it is. Draven started forward. But I'd rather be deluded and loyal than strategic and treacherous. The guards moved to intercept, but Cassian waved them back. This is between brothers. Stand down. Smart move. Cassian had always been a skilled fighter, not as dominant as Draven had been before the ritual, but against a weakened king with multiple wounds and days of exhaustion, the odds were balanced. They circled each other in the firelit darkness. Blood brothers who'd trained together as children, now preparing to kill each other over a throne and a dying queen. All that family history reducing down to steel and hate and competing philosophies about what power was supposed to protect. You could have supported me. Draven kept his sword ready. Could have helped me search for a cure instead of hiring killers. Why would I support suicide? Cassian's blade traced lazy patterns. You're destroying yourself chasing impossible solutions. Someone had to be ready to pick up the pieces when you finally broke completely. So you decided to accelerate my breaking. Draven attacked. The fight was brutal and close. Cassian was fresh and uninjured. Draven was weakened and bleeding. But Draven had something his brother lacked. 36 years of surviving situations that should have killed him. Experience that taught him how to fight smart when strength wasn't enough. He used terrain, positioning, leverage that multiplied force without requiring raw power. Cassian fought with technical precision, perfect form, textbook combinations. Draven fought like someone with nothing to lose. The difference showed after 2 minutes. Cassian started making mistakes, overextending, committing too fully to attacks that left him vulnerable. Draven punished every error, small cuts that accumulated, strikes that damaged without killing immediately, death by 1,000 wounds. Finally, Cassian's leg gave out. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard. Blood ran from a dozen different injuries. Draven stood over him with his sword ready for the final strike. Do it! Cassian looked up with defiance that hadn't quite broken. Kill your brother. Prove you're exactly as ruthless as I always said. The moment stretched. Firelight painted everything red. Around them, the battle was ending. Cassian's forces were dead or captured. The stronghold burned. Draven could end this now. One strike. Eliminate the threat permanently. But something stopped him. Not mercy exactly. Cassian didn't deserve mercy. But killing him felt like surrendering to the logic that had poisoned their relationship. The idea that power required eliminating everyone who challenged you. That family became expendable the moment it turned into liability. Draven had spent 3 years ruling through that logic. It had kept the Empire stable, but hollowed him out from inside. Finding Selene alive had reminded him why power mattered in the first place. Not for its own sake, but for what it could protect when used differently. No. Draven lowered his sword. I'm not killing you. Then you're weak. Cassian spat blood. Just like I said. Maybe. Draven stepped back. But you're exiled. Again. This time to territories so remote you'll never find your way back. If I ever see you within 1,000 miles of Valor's borders, I'll finish this. But tonight you get to live with the knowledge that your brother beat you while wounded and old. He turned to the warriors watching. Take him. Escort him to the eastern wastelands and leave him with nothing but the clothes he's wearing. Your Majesty? General Markoth approached. With respect, executing him would be cleaner. Probably. Draven started toward his horse. But I'm done choosing clean over right. He lives. That's final. The warriors moved to secure Cassian. Draven mounted his horse, feeling every injury and every year that had been stolen from him. But he'd won. Not through superior strength, not through perfect execution, but through refusing to break when everything said breaking was inevitable. The ride back to the capital took 7 days. By the time they arrived, infection had set into Draven's shoulder wound. Fever made him delirious. He barely remembered the final approach to the palace. Healers worked for 3 days stabilizing him. They drained infected tissue, administered medicines that tasted like poison, monitored vital signs while his body fought to survive injuries that would have been manageable before the ritual. When consciousness finally returned clearly, Selene was sitting beside his bed. She'd been there the entire time, according to the healers, refusing to sleep, writing endless notes to medical staff about his condition. Draven reached for her hand and she grabbed it like he was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. You won. She showed him paper with those two words written over and over. You won. You won. You won. Barely. His voice came out hoarse. Cassian's alive. Exiled, but alive. She wrote quickly, "Why let him live? Because killing him would have meant becoming everything he accused me of being." Draven pulled her closer. "I chose you over strength. Chose mercy over clean solutions. Maybe that makes me weak, like he said. But I'd rather be weak and human than strong and empty." Selene pressed her forehead against his. Silent tears tracked down her face, while her body shook with emotions the curse wouldn't let her express through sound. Outside the palace windows, Veilor spread beneath them, an empire that had just watched their king survive impossible odds through will instead of dominance. The nobles would calculate, the enemies would test, the throne would remain unstable. But Draven had proven something that mattered more than stability. He'd proven that love didn't equal weakness, that sacrifice didn't equal surrender, that an aging king could still defend what mattered when strength alone would have failed. And in the quiet mathematics of power versus humanity, he'd chosen humanity without apology. Now they'd both live with the consequences of that choice. Together. Spring came to Veilor 3 months after the mountain battle. Snow melted from palace rooftops. Gardens that had been frozen wastelands began showing green shoots. The city emerged from winter like something waking from a long illness. Draven stood on the balcony watching the transformation happen. His shoulder had healed, but the wound left a scar that ached when weather changed. His body had adjusted to its new limitations the way organisms adapted to survive altered conditions. He was 56 now in everything except chronological years. The mirror showed silver hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. His hands showed age spots. His strength remained diminished, but he was alive. And Selene slept in the chambers behind him, breathing steadily for the first time since the curse had awakened. The empire had settled into an uneasy stability. The nobles who'd calculated rebellion decided that an aging king who survived impossible odds through sheer will was more dangerous than a young king who relied purely on strength. Word had spread about the mountain battle, about Draven riding wounded for 3 days to confront his brother, about him choosing mercy when execution would have been easier. Perception had shifted in unexpected ways. Instead of seeing weakness, the empire saw something that commanded a different kind of respect. A ruler willing to sacrifice everything for what mattered had proven himself in ways dominance alone never could. It wasn't the power structure Draven had inherited, but it was the one he'd built through choices that prioritized humanity over empty strength. And surprisingly, it was holding. Behind him, footsteps approached. Selene emerged from the chambers wearing simple robes that showed her pregnancy more clearly now. 8 months along. Still frozen in development but stable. The healers had finally confirmed what everyone suspected. The curse's interruption had created a biological stasis. Their child remained alive but wouldn't continue developing until something broke the remaining magic. They'd been searching for 3 months. Every scholar in the Empire focused on finding a solution that didn't require more sacrifice. So far, nothing had worked. Selene handed him paper with her morning message. "Spring looks good on you." Draven smiled despite how the compliment felt like gentle mockery. "I look like I aged 20 years in a single night," she wrote quickly. "You look like someone who chose love over vanity. Better. Is it though?" He kept his tone light, but the question was serious. The Empire respects will, but it still values strength. Every day I rule from this weakened state invites someone to test whether I've become a liability. Let them test. Selene underlined the words. You've proven strength isn't just physical. They know that now. She was right in theory, but theory and practice diverged when power dynamics were involved. An aging king could command respect through reputation and will, but at some point, physical limitations would create opportunities that ambitious people couldn't resist exploiting. Draven was living on borrowed time, not from the ritual's cost, from the inevitable calculation that happened when rulers showed vulnerability. That was the truth about power that no throne ever admitted openly. It required constant performance, constant proof that challenging authority meant certain defeat. Any gap in that performance created space for rivals to imagine themselves successful, and imagination was the first step toward action. A knock interrupted his thoughts. General Markoth entered carrying reports that had arrived with the morning dispatches. Your Majesty. The old warrior looked tired. We have a situation. Of course they did. Situations were the default state of running an empire. What happened? The southern border lords are disputing trade agreements. Markoth laid out documents. They're claiming the terms negotiated 3 years ago are no longer valid given the changes in leadership dynamics. Leadership dynamics. Draven caught the careful phrasing. You mean they're testing whether an aged king will enforce agreements that relied on intimidation? Essentially, yes. There it was. The challenge he'd been expecting since recovering from his wounds. The nobles weren't stupid. They'd watched him age 20 years, watched him struggle through injuries that would have been minor inconveniences before the ritual. Now they were probing whether he still had the capacity to enforce his will when resistance emerged. What are they demanding? Reduce tariffs. Markoth pointed to specific clauses. Greater autonomy on internal governance. Basically, they want to keep the empire's protection while reducing what they contribute. Classic power play. Test the boundaries. See how much you could take before authority pushed back. The old Draven would have ridden south with an army and reminded them why agreements got honored, regardless of who felt inconvenienced. But that Draven had possessed strength that made threats credible without needing to prove them constantly. This version had to calculate whether enforcement was worth the cost when every confrontation revealed his limitations. That was the mathematics of ruling from weakness. Every flex of authority spent resources you couldn't replenish. Every threat had to be backed by will instead of guaranteed dominance. And will was a finite resource that exhausted differently than muscle. Schedule a diplomatics mission. Draven made the decision that felt like swallowing broken glass. I'll meet with the border lords personally, negotiate new terms that address their concerns while maintaining empire integrity. You're going to give them concessions. Markoth looked surprised. Your Majesty, that sets a precedent. Every other territory will demand similar treatment, probably. Draven folded the reports. But crushing them militarily would cost resources and reveal limitations I'd rather keep ambiguous. Sometimes strength means knowing when to bend instead of break. The general absorbed this with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to adapt to changing leadership styles. If that's your decision, I'll arrange the diplomatic convoy. After Markoth left, Selene wrote a new message. You're changing how you rule. Had to. Draven read the words. The king who relied on physical dominance doesn't exist anymore. Either I adapt or I get replaced by someone who doesn't carry my limitations. Is that bad? He considered the question seriously. Changing how you ruled meant admitting previous methods no longer worked. It meant evolution driven by necessity rather than choice. It meant learning to lead differently when the foundation you'd built your authority on had crumbled. From a pure power perspective, it was weakness. Adaptation signaled that circumstances had forced modification. But from a survival perspective, it was the only rational response to altered conditions. No. Draven finally answered. It's not bad. It's just different. And different feels like failure until you realize it's the only path forward. Selene moved closer. She pressed her hand against his chest where the mate bond pulsed with that irregular rhythm that had become their new normal. They stood there while spring sunlight painted the balcony warm colors and the city below continued its daily functions. Two damaged people holding on to each other, while the empire around them adapted to rule that prioritized different values than raw strength. It wasn't the future either of them had imagined, but it was the one they'd built through choices that refused to surrender what mattered when everything said surrendering was the rational move. And maybe that was enough. The diplomatic mission to the Southern Territories took 3 weeks. Draven traveled with minimal military escort deliberately. Showing up with overwhelming force would have undermined the message he was trying to send, that the Empire was willing to negotiate from a position of mutual respect instead of pure intimidation. The border lords were surprised when he arrived. They'd expected threats or military posturing. Instead, they got a king willing to sit across negotiating tables and discuss their concerns like they were partners instead of subordinates. The meetings were tense. Every lord present was measuring whether Draven's apparent reasonableness was strategy or weakness, testing how far they could push before the famous Alpha King temper emerged. But Draven had learned something during his recovery. Anger was a tool that worked when you had strength to back up threats. Without that strength, anger just revealed vulnerability that smart people exploited. So he negotiated calmly, addressed concerns, made concessions that preserved empire integrity while giving the border lords enough autonomy to feel respected. It took 2 weeks to hammer out new agreements that both sides could accept. When Draven returned to the capital, General Markoth was waiting with a report on how other territories were reacting. Mixed responses. The general laid out intelligence summaries. Some see it as pragmatic leadership. Others interpret it as confirmation that you've lost the capacity for decisive force. Both interpretations are probably correct. Draven scanned the reports. I have lost some capacity for force. Pretending otherwise would be stupid. But I've gained capacity for solutions that don't require military violence. That has value, even if it looks like weakness to people who only respect domination. The nobles are watching carefully. Markoth pointed to specific names, measuring whether this represents a permanent shift in governance style or temporary adaptation. Let them watch. Draven handed the reports back. Eventually they'll figure out that permanent versus temporary doesn't matter. What matters is whether the empire stays intact and people can live without constant fear of violence from above. That's a very different philosophy than the one you ruled with before. Because I'm a very different king than I was before. The admission hung in the air between them. Draven had spent 3 years ruling through grief-fueled violence. Then he'd sacrificed physical dominance to save Selene. Then he'd survived a mountain battle that should have killed him. Each transformation had stripped away pieces of the ruler he'd been, while adding new understanding about what power was actually supposed to accomplish. And somewhere in that process, Draven had stopped seeing the throne as a tool for dominating others, and started seeing it as a responsibility to protect what mattered when the world wanted to destroy it. That shift changed everything. How he made decisions, what he prioritized, who he was willing to become. The old Draven would have seen it as weakness. The new version understood it as evolution driven by hard lessons about what actually lasted when strength faded. You're going to face challenges. Markoth spoke carefully. Ambitious nobles who see your changed approach as opportunity. They'll test boundaries. Some will push for more autonomy. Others will attempt outright rebellion. I know. Draven had run the same calculations. Let them come. I'd rather face challenges while building something worth defending than maintain perfect control over an empire I've hollowed out through excessive violence. Even if it costs you the throne. Especially if it costs me the throne. Draven met his eyes. Because a throne held through terror alone isn't worth the price it demands from everyone trapped beneath it. The general nodded slowly. Then I'll continue preparing defensive strategies for when the challenges come. Do that. But also prepare diplomatic strategies. Not every challenge requires military response anymore. After Markoth left, Draven stood alone in the throne room where he'd pronounced so many judgments and executed so many sentences. The space felt different now. Less like a seat of absolute power. More like a platform for trying to balance competing interests while maintaining enough authority to prevent collapse. It was harder than pure dominance. Required more thought, more compromise, more acceptance that perfection wasn't achievable and pragmatic solutions mattered more than absolute control. But it was also more sustainable, because empires built purely on fear eventually fractured when the fear faded. What Draven was building now had a chance to outlast him if he could successfully transition from dominance-based rule to something more resilient, and that mattered more than personal legacy or maintaining the image of invincibility. 6 months after the diplomatic mission, Selene went into labor. It happened without warning. One moment she was fine, the next moment she collapsed in the gardens, clutching her abdomen, while the frozen pregnancy suddenly resumed development with violent speed. The healers rushed her to the royal chambers. Mireth the scholar arrived within minutes, looking both excited and terrified. The curse is breaking. She examined Selene quickly. The ritual created a stable stasis, but something has triggered the final release. The pregnancy is completing now, all 9 months of development happening in hours instead of weeks. Is that survivable? Draven kept his voice level. I don't know. Mireth's honesty was brutal. This has never happened before. The curse, the ritual, the interrupted transformation. All of it is unprecedented. She might survive. The baby might survive. Both might die. We're in completely unknown territory. Then we adapt. Draven moved to Selene's side. Same way we've adapted to everything else that should have killed us. The labor lasted 14 hours. Selene screamed without sound while her body tried to complete a process that had been frozen for nearly a year. The healers worked frantically, administered medicines, monitored vital signs that fluctuated wildly. Draven stayed beside her the entire time, held her hand, whispered encouragement she probably couldn't hear through the pain, and thought about all the moments that had led to this. The night she'd collapsed at the moon court, the staged death in the mountains, 3 years of separation, the ritual that had aged him, the battle against Cassian, all of it converging on this moment where life or death balanced on biological processes they didn't fully understand. Near dawn, the baby was born. A daughter. She came out screaming with healthy lungs and violet eyes that matched her mother's exactly. The healers cleaned her quickly while Selene collapsed back against pillows looking more exhausted than Draven had ever seen her. But alive. Both alive. Mirith examined the baby thoroughly. No obvious curse markers. Her voice carried cautious optimism. No signs of the bloodline magic that affected her mother. The ritual might have cleansed it from this generation entirely. Might have. Draven caught the qualifier. But you're not certain. We won't know for years. Mirith handed him his daughter. The curse activated at different ages for different women in Selene's bloodline. We'll need to monitor her development carefully. But for now, she appears healthy and uncursed. Draven held his daughter with the careful grip of someone who'd spent decades handling weapons and suddenly had to cradle something infinitely more fragile. She was so small, so perfectly formed, looking at him with eyes that already held intelligence, even hours old. This was what they'd fought for, what Selene had survived 3 years of wilderness exile for, what Draven had aged 20 years to protect. A life that hadn't asked to be born into this mess, but deserved a chance anyway. He carried her to Selene, who looked at their daughter with tears streaming silently down her face. Reached out with shaking hands to touch the baby's cheek. Selene wrote on paper someone had left beside the bed. What's her name? Draven hadn't thought about it. They'd been so focused on survival that naming had seemed premature, something you did after you knew everyone would live. But looking at his daughter with her violet eyes and perfect features, one name felt right. Lysandra. He said it out loud. After your grandmother, the one who survived the curse longest. Selene nodded, then wrote, Lysandra Valaris Kaelthorn, their daughter, product of a bloodline curse and a ritual that had rewritten biological rules. Born into an empire that was learning to value will over strength. She represented everything they'd sacrificed to preserve, the hope that love could matter more than power when you were willing to pay the cost. And maybe that was the real victory. Not defeating the curse completely, not maintaining absolute control over an empire, but creating space for something innocent to exist when everything said it should have died. That was what power was actually supposed to accomplish. Protection of things that couldn't protect themselves. Creation of conditions where love didn't have to choose between survival and surrender. Draven had spent most of his life believing strength was the ultimate answer, that dominance solved every problem. But holding his daughter while Selene slept fitfully beside them, he understood what his ancestors had never carved into royal monuments. Strength created empires. Love made them worth having. Bamchets. 5 years passed. Lysandra grew into a child who showed none of her mother's curse markers. She ran through palace halls with energy that exhausted everyone watching, spoke in complete sentences by age 3, asked questions that revealed frightening intelligence. The healers monitored her constantly. Every birthday brought new tests, new examinations, new confirmation that whatever the curse had been, it hadn't transferred to this generation. The ritual had broken it, or the pregnancy interruption had, or some combination of factors they didn't fully understand. Either way, their daughter appeared free of the magic that had destroyed women in Selene's bloodline for centuries. That alone made every sacrifice worth it. Selene never recovered her voice. The curse had taken it permanently, but she'd learned to communicate through written notes and expressions that Draven had become fluent in reading. She'd also transformed the empire itself, established sanctuaries for people afflicted with blood magic, funded research into curses that mainstream healers refused to study, created legal protections for those whose conditions made them targets. All the things she'd wished existed when her own curse activated. The nobles had resisted initially, claimed it was waste of resources, complained about dangerous precedents. But Selene had persistence that outlasted opposition, and Draven backed her completely despite political costs, because that was what power was for. Not maintaining empty dominance, but creating space for compassion when the world wanted to crush it. Together they'd changed Vaelor from an empire built purely on strength into something more complex. Still dangerous, still capable of violence when necessary, but balanced by recognition that human dignity mattered even when it wasn't profitable or strategically optimal. It made them vulnerable to criticism, made the empire seem softer than neighbors who ruled through pure intimidation. But it also created loyalty that fear alone never could. People fought harder for rulers who demonstrated that individual lives mattered than for rulers who treated everyone as expendable resources. And in the cold mathematics of long-term stability, loyalty outlasted fear. Draven's body continued aging according to the ritual's accelerated timeline. By the time Lysandra turned 5, he looked 70, despite being chronologically 41. His strength had diminished to the point where sparring with palace guards required genuine effort. His endurance limited how long he could govern before exhaustion forced rest, but his mind remained sharp, and his will hadn't diminished at all. The nobles who'd expected an aging king to become manipulable discovered that will mattered more than physical capacity. Draven made decisions with the same decisive authority he'd always possessed, enforced boundaries when necessary, negotiated when possible. He'd become a different kind of ruler than the one who'd taken the throne at 18. Less terrifying, more pragmatic, willing to admit limitations while working around them. And surprisingly, it was working. The empire remained stable, borders held, trade flourished, people lived without constant fear of violence from above. Not perfect, but better than what came before. One evening, Draven stood on the balcony watching Lysandra play in the gardens below. Selene joined him carrying paper with her sunset message. "She's everything we fought for, and more." Draven watched their daughter chase butterflies with the fearless energy of children who'd never known true danger. "She's going to be formidable when she grows up, like her father." Draven smiled despite how the compliment felt generous. "I'm not formidable anymore. I'm just stubborn about refusing to surrender." Same thing, Selene underlined it. Being formidable isn't about strength. It's about knowing what matters and refusing to compromise on it. Maybe that was true. Draven had certainly learned the lesson through brutal experience. You didn't need to be the strongest person in the room to be the most dangerous. You just needed to care about something enough that losing it became unacceptable. That made you predictable in some ways. Enemies could target what you loved knowing you'd react. But it also made you resilient in ways pure strength never achieved. Because when you were protecting something that mattered, surrender stopped being an option. You found ways to keep fighting when logic said you should quit, and persistence outlasted almost every other advantage. "What do you think she'll face?" Draven gestured toward Lysandra. "What kind of empire will she inherit?" "Better than the one we started with," Selene wrote quickly. "Not perfect, but better." "Is better enough, though?" He voiced the doubt that haunted him. "We've made changes, but the fundamental power structures remain. Nobles still calculate advantage. Borders still require military defense. Violence still underpins everything even when we try minimizing it. Better is always enough." Selene's writing got aggressive. Perfection isn't real. Better is the only victory that matters. She was right. Draven had spent too many years chasing absolute solutions, complete dominance, perfect control. All illusions that crumbled the moment you examined them closely. Better was achievable. Better could be built through incremental choices. Better lasted because it acknowledged limitations while working within them. And maybe that was the final lesson power taught when you survived long enough to learn it. Empires weren't built on strength alone. They were built on thousands of small decisions that chose better over perfect every single day. Lysandra ran toward them, shouting about the butterfly she'd almost caught. Her violet eyes sparkled with excitement that reminded Draven of Selene before the curse. That was their legacy. Not an empire held through perfect dominance, but a daughter who could run through gardens without fear, and a kingdom learning to value will over strength. Imperfect, unstable, constantly requiring adaptation, but better than what came before, and better was enough. 10 years after the ritual, Draven stood in the throne room pronouncing judgment on a noble who'd attempted rebellion. The man had calculated that an aging king lacked capacity to respond forcefully, had rallied supporters, had moved to seize territory. He'd been wrong. Not because Draven had crushed him militarily, but because the other nobles had refused to support the rebellion. They'd seen 10 years of pragmatic rule that balanced authority with compassion. They'd watched an aging king adapt instead of break. And they'd decided that stability under Draven was preferable to chaos under someone who promised strength without wisdom. So the rebellion had collapsed before requiring military intervention. That was the power of building legitimacy through actions instead of fear. It created resilience that pure dominance never achieved. "You're stripped of lands and title," Draven pronounced sentence, "exiled to territories where your ambition can't endanger anyone. If you ever return, execution will be immediate." The man was dragged away protesting, but his protest sounded hollow. Everyone present understood that rebellion without support was just suicide with extra steps. After the throne room cleared, Selene appeared with Lysandra beside her. Their daughter was 10 now, tall for her age, already showing the intelligence and fierce determination that marked both bloodlines. She'd asked to attend court sessions, to learn how power actually functioned instead of theoretical lessons. Draven had agreed because sheltering her served no purpose. The Empire was brutal. Leadership demanded understanding that brutality without flinching. Better she learned it while he could provide context. "Why did you exile him instead of execute him?" Lysandra asked the question with genuine curiosity instead of judgment. "Because execution is permanent." Draven gestured for her to join him on the throne steps. "It sends a message that can't be reversed. Exile allows for possibility that people can change. But he tried to take your throne." Lysandra's expression showed confusion. "Doesn't that deserve death?" "Maybe." Draven chose his words carefully. "But I've learned that what people deserve matters less than what creates the world you want to live in. I want to live in a world where mercy is possible even for enemies. So I choose mercy when I can, even if it makes you look weak." Strength isn't just about appearing invincible. Draven met her eyes. It's about knowing what you value and having the will to protect it regardless of how it looks to people watching. Lysandra absorbed this silently, then asked, "Is that why you saved Mother? Even though it cost you your strength?" "Yes." "Would you do it again?" Her violet eyes studied him, knowing everything it cost, every single time. Draven didn't hesitate. "Your mother is worth more than strength, than thrones, than empires, some things you protect because losing them would hollow you out from inside." Selene had been watching silently. Now she wrote a message and showed it to both of them. That's what being alpha really means. Not dominating everyone. Protecting what matters when the world wants to destroy it. Lysandra read the note twice, then looked at Draven with an expression that showed she was starting to understand. The throne didn't exist to make him powerful. It existed to give him platform to protect what mattered when protection required resources beyond individual capacity. That was the truth about leadership that no crown admitted openly. Power was never the goal. It was the tool, the means, the resource you spent protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. And when you understood that distinction, everything changed. How you ruled, what you prioritized, who you became. Draven had spent decades learning that lesson, had sacrificed strength to internalize it completely, had rebuilt an empire around principles that valued humanity over empty dominance. And now he was teaching it to his daughter so she could build something even better when her time came. That was legacy, not monuments or conquered territories, but ideas that survived long after the person who embodied them turned to dust. 20 years after the ritual, Draven knew he was dying. His body had aged at accelerated rates for 2 decades. He looked 90, despite being chronologically 56. His strength had faded to the point where walking required assistance. His breathing came labored, even at rest. The healers said it was simply time catching up with magic's cost. The ritual had traded years for Selene's stability. Now those years were collecting their debt. Draven accepted it with the same pragmatism he'd learned to apply to everything else. He'd made the choice, had known the cost, had decided Selene's survival mattered more than his longevity. No regrets. Lysandra was 20 now, brilliant, fierce, being prepared to inherit a throne she'd spent her entire life learning to wield differently than her father. Selene remained stable. The curse had settled into permanent stasis. She'd never speak again, never fully heal. But she'd survived long enough to watch their daughter grow into someone formidable, worth it. On a spring morning that reminded Draven of the day Lysandra was born, he called his family to the royal chambers. Selene arrived first, moving carefully but steady. 20 years had aged her too, but nowhere near as dramatically as the ritual had aged him. Lysandra came next, wearing the formal robes that marked her as heir apparent, ready for responsibilities she'd been training toward her entire life. Draven looked at them both from where he sat propped against pillows that made breathing easier. This was his legacy. Not the empire, not the throne, but these two people who'd been worth every sacrifice. I don't have long. He spoke clearly despite how the effort exhausted him. Days, maybe. So I need to say things while I still can. Dad. Lysandra started, but he waved her silent. Let me finish. Draven gathered his thoughts. I've made a lot of mistakes. Ruled through fear when I should have chosen wisdom. Prioritized strength when humanity mattered more. But I got one thing right. I chose love when power said I shouldn't. Chose protecting what mattered over maintaining dominance. And that choice made me a better ruler than strength alone ever could. Selene was crying silently. Lysandra fought to maintain composure. When I'm gone. Draven looked at his daughter. You'll face pressure to rule like I did at the beginning, through dominance and fear. Don't. Rule like I learned to at the end, through will and wisdom and understanding that empires exist to protect people, not control them. I will. Lysandra's voice cracked. I promise. And remember. Draven smiled despite the pain. Strength is overrated, will last longer. Choose what matters and refuse to surrender it regardless of cost. That's the only power that survives after you're gone. He reached for Selene's hand. She grabbed it like he was the only thing keeping her anchored. You saved me. His voice dropped to a whisper. Not just from the curse, from becoming someone who confused strength with worth. Thank you for that, Selene wrote with shaking hands. No. You saved me. Chose me when power said you shouldn't. We saved each other, Draven corrected. That's how love works when you do it right. They sat together while spring sunlight painted the chamber's warm colors, while Draven's breathing grew more labored and his grip weakened. He'd ruled for 38 years, had conquered territories and executed rivals, and reshaped an empire through decisions both brilliant and brutal. But lying there holding Selene's hand while their daughter watched with tears streaming down her face, Draven understood what actually mattered. Not the territories, not the throne, not the legacy carved in stone. Just these moments, these people, these choices that had transformed him from a king who ruled through fear into someone who'd learned that love was the only power worth having. As consciousness faded, Draven's last thought was simple. Worth it. All of it. Every sacrifice. Every choice. Every moment that had led to building something better than what he'd inherited. Worth it. Eek. The Empire mourned for 30 days. They buried Draven with full honors, built monuments that would last centuries, wrote his name in history beside the conquerors and reformers who'd shaped Valor's evolution. But the real legacy wasn't in stone. It was in how Lysandra ruled, with her father's will and her mother's compassion, maintaining strength when necessary while prioritizing humanity when possible. It was in the sanctuary Selene had built, still operating 20 years later, still protecting people whose curses made them targets. It was in how the Empire had transformed from a system built purely on dominance into something more resilient. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Always better. Selene lived another 15 years after Draven died. She watched Lysandra marry and produce heirs who showed no curse markers. Watched the Empire continue evolving toward values Draven had died defending. And on the last night of her life, sitting on the same balcony where she'd stood beside him so many times, Selene wrote one final message. To whoever finds this, Know that love is not weakness, sacrifice is not surrender, and the throne belongs to whoever refuses to give up what matters when the world says they should. Draven taught me that. Now I'm teaching you. Choose better. Always choose better. The note was found the next morning beside her body. She died peacefully, looking out over an empire that had been worth fighting for. And in the palace archives, where royal documents were preserved for future generations, that note became the most referenced text in Valor's history. Not because it was profound by itself, but because it captured the truth that Draven and Selene had learned through brutal experience. Power was never the goal. Love was. Protection was. Building something better than what came before. That was what being alpha really meant. Not dominating everyone, but having the strength to choose humanity when dominance would have been easier. And that lesson survived long after the people who embodied it turned to dust. Because ideas lived longer than empires when you built them on truth instead of illusion. And the truth was simple, terrifying, beautiful. Love was the only power that lasted, the only strength that mattered when everything else crumbled. Everything else was just violence wearing different names.